Picture this: a structure so precisely aligned with the stars that modern engineers still argue over how it was done, without metal tools, without wheels, without a single written explanation left behind. That's not fiction. That's Tuesday for archaeologists. Every continent hides at least one site that breaks the rules of what we think ancient people could achieve. A city swallowed by jungle for 1,000 years. A script no one has ever translated. A tomb sealed shut for a reason we may never know. Over the next 3 hours, we're chasing down 12 of these mysteries. The real ones, the ones still open. Let's get into it. On the main island of Orkney, in a flat expanse of farmland beneath a sky that seems too large for the land it covers, there is a mound. From a distance, it looks like nothing more than a grassy hill, the kind a sheep might graze on without a second thought. But this hill was built. Every stone, every angle, every inch of turf laid over it was placed by human hands more than 5,000 years ago. This is Maeshowe, and it has been waiting in that field since roughly 2800 BC, older than Stonehenge's famous trilithons, older than the Great Pyramid at Giza. To enter, you have to bend low and walk through a narrow stone passage nearly 11 meters long, aligned with a precision that feels deliberate rather than accidental. And it is. For a few weeks around the winter solstice, as the sun sets low on the horizon, its light travels down that passage and strikes the back wall of the central chamber directly. The builders of Maeshowe, a Neolithic farming community we know remarkably little about, engineered a structure that captures a moment of celestial alignment, using nothing but stone, sight lines, and an intimate understanding of the sky above them. What was it for? The mainstream answer is that Maeshowe is a chambered cairn, a tomb, built to house the dead, possibly of a ruling family or a revered lineage. But here's where the certainty starts to thin. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 19th century, they found no skeletons, no grave goods, no clear evidence of burial at all. For a structure this elaborate, this labor-intensive, built by a community that would have needed years, maybe decades, to quarry and move stones weighing several tons, the absence of bodies is strange. Was Maeshowe robbed long before modern archaeologists arrived? Were the dead removed deliberately for reasons lost to us? Or was the tomb theory wrong from the start? That question opens the door to something else entirely. In the 12th century, Norse crusaders broke into Maeshowe seeking shelter from a storm, and they left their mark. Literally. The walls are covered in runic graffiti, the largest collection of runes ever found outside Scandinavia. Some boast of treasure, some mention a woman. One simply reads, "These runes were carved by the man most skilled in runes west of the ocean." It's a rare, almost startling glimpse of medieval voices echoing inside a monument already 3,000 years old when they arrived. The Vikings too seemed to sense that Maeshowe was more than an empty hill. From here, the theories begin to drift further from the documented record. Some researchers have proposed that Maeshowe functioned less as a tomb and more as a calendar, a kind of solar instrument used to track the turning of the year, with burial as only one of several purposes. Others have noted the broader pattern across Orkney. Maeshowe sits within sight of the ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stennis, as though the entire landscape were part of a single, coordinated design whose full purpose we no longer have the context to read. Fringe theories go further still, suggesting astronomical knowledge beyond what Neolithic farmers are typically credited with. Most archaeologists are skeptical of these leaps, but they rarely dismiss the solstice alignment itself, because that part is simply verifiably true. So, what was Maeshowe in the minds of the people who built it? A house for the dead? A monument to the turning year? Something we don't yet have a word for? The light still finds its way down that passage every winter just as it did 5,000 years ago, reaching toward a chamber that, for all we've learned, still keeps its silence. If the stones of Orkney whisper of sun and season, half a world away another monument rises, not from grassy lowland, but from the dust of Mesopotamia, not buried in earth, but built to dominate the sky itself. Where Maeshowe hides its purpose in silence and absence, this structure does the opposite. It announces itself for miles, a mountain of mud brick rising from the flat Iraqi plain, visible long before you understand what you're looking at. This is the Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu, and though its builders left us far more than the people of Neolithic Orkney ever did, the questions it raises are, in their own way, just as unresolved. Today, locals and travelers know the site as Akar Kuf, a massive eroded mound rising some 57 meters above the desert floor northwest of Baghdad. Even in its ruined state, its outer casing long stripped away, its corners softened by 4,000 years of wind, it remains one of the tallest surviving structures from the ancient Near East. To stand at its base is to feel something close to vertigo, not from height alone, but from time. This was not built by a civilization we glimpse only through scattered fragments. We know who built it, we know roughly when. And yet, the more we learn, the more the site seems to hold back. The ziggurat was constructed around the 14th century BC under the order of King Kurigalzu III, founder of a new capital city he named after himself, Dur-Kurigalzu, Fortress of Kurigalzu. Kurigalzu ruled as part of the Kassite dynasty, a people who had taken control of Babylon centuries earlier and ruled it for nearly 400 years, longer than almost any other dynasty in Mesopotamian history. And yet, ask most people, even those well-versed in ancient history, who the Kassites were, and you'll likely be met with silence. They are, in a real sense, one of history's most successful forgotten powers. Why does a dynasty that ruled Babylon for 4 centuries remain so obscure, while their predecessors and successors are household names? The answer, frustratingly, may simply be the accident of what survives. Kassite-era texts are far scarcer than those of the Babylonians who came before or the Assyrians who came after. An empire's memory, it turns out, depends less on what it accomplished and more on what later scribes chose to copy down. The ziggurat itself was built as a temple to Enlil, one of the most powerful gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, lord of wind, breath, and the space between heaven and earth. Structurally, it follows the familiar ziggurat formula, a stepped tower of sun-dried mud brick, faced with fired brick, built in receding terraces meant to bring the temple at its summit closer to the divine. In this sense, there's nothing mysterious about Dur-Kurigalzu at all. It is a textbook example of Mesopotamian religious architecture, and archaeologists have used it for decades as a reference point for understanding how these structures were engineered and why they so often survive when other buildings collapse. But look closer, and the mundane explanation begins to fray at the edges. Excavations at the site, carried out in fits and starts since the 1940s, often interrupted by regional conflict, have uncovered something unusual in the ziggurat's construction. Reed matting, woven and laid between courses of mud brick at regular intervals throughout the structure. Conventional explanation holds that this was a practical measure, a way to reinforce the brickwork, allow moisture to escape, and prevent the immense weight of the upper terraces from causing the lower courses to buckle and shear under their own mass. It's a reasonable, well-supported theory, and it's likely correct, at least in part. And yet the sheer consistency and precision of the technique, repeated across millions of bricks over years of construction, has led some researchers to wonder whether the reed layers served a purpose beyond engineering, whether there was a ritual or symbolic dimension to embedding organic material, layer after layer, inside a monument built to reach toward the heavens. Was it merely structural? Or did the builders believe they were weaving something living into the bones of their god's house? There is also the matter of the city around it. Dur-Kurigalzu was no minor outpost. It was a capital, complete with palaces, residential quarters, and administrative buildings, evidence of a sophisticated bureaucratic state. And yet, within a relatively short span after Kurigalzu's reign, the city's prominence faded. Babylon reasserted itself as the political center, and Dur-Kurigalzu slipped into a kind of quiet decline, not destroyed in some dramatic conquest, but gradually abandoned, left to the wind and the slow erosion of mud brick under desert sun. Why build an entirely new capital at such cost and ambition, only for it to be allowed to fade within a few generations? Was it a political statement that lost its relevance once its founder died? A religious center that simply couldn't compete with Babylon's older, deeper claim to sacred authority? The texts that might answer this question, if they ever existed in meaningful numbers, have not survived, or have not yet been found. What remains is the mound itself, climbing out of the plain like a question with no one left to answer it. Modern visitors can still climb partway up its eroded slopes, tracing the same ascent that Kassid priests once made toward Enlil's sanctuary at the summit. The reed matting is still visible in places where the brick has crumbled away, ordinary and strange in equal measure. Was it engineering, ritual, or both, woven so thoroughly into the structure that the builders themselves no longer saw a difference between the practical and the sacred? Dur-Kurigalzu does not hide in silence, as Maeshowe does. It stands in plain sight, fully documented, fully excavated, and somehow still asking us to explain it. From the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, where a god's house climbed toward the sky in full view of an empire, we return now to the quieter, greener landscape of the British countryside, to a hill that, like Maeshowe, conceals far more than it reveals. But this is not Orkney, and this is not Neolithic Scotland. This is Somerset, in the soft rolling farmland near the village of Wellow, where a long, grass-covered mound stretches across a hillside like something half-remembered. This is Stony Littleton Long Barrow, and it has been keeping its secrets for nearly 6,000 years. Approach it from below, along the footpath that winds up from the valley, and you might walk past it entirely if you didn't know what you were looking for. It rises gently from the field, a long earthen ridge some 30 meters in length, its grassy slopes blending so completely into the surrounding pasture that early travelers likely mistook it for a natural feature of the land. Only the entrance gives it away, a low, stone-framed doorway set into the rounded end of the mound, flanked by a pair of large upright stones, and a lintel carved with the unmistakable spiral fossil of an ammonite, pressed into the rock millions of years before any human hand touched it. Did the builders choose that particular stone by accident, or did they recognize the fossil for what it was? A strange, spiraled shape from a world that existed long before their own, and decide it belonged at the threshold of a place built for the dead. Stony Littleton is what archaeologists call a Cotswold Severn long barrow, a type of chambered tomb built across southwest Britain during the early Neolithic period, somewhere around 3700 to 3500 BC. That makes it older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid, a contemporary of the earliest farming communities to take root in the British Isles after thousands of years of hunter-gatherer life. To build it, those early farmers quarried and moved dozens of large stones, then constructed a central passage running deep into the mound, branching off into 6 smaller side chambers, 3 pairs facing one another, like rooms off a long, dark hallway. Crawl into that passage today, as visitors still can, and you'll find yourself in absolute darkness within a few steps, the outside world reduced to a small, bright doorway behind you. When archaeologists first properly excavated the Barrow in the 19th century, they found what you might expect from a tomb: human remains. The bones of at least 10 individuals, possibly more, scattered across the chambers, though not in any arrangement resembling a conventional burial. There were no neatly laid skeletons, no clear individual graves. Instead, the bones were disarticulated, mixed together, seemingly sorted in some cases by type, skulls grouped separately from long bones in certain chambers. This pattern isn't unique to Stony Littleton. It appears across many Neolithic long barrows in Britain, and it has led mainstream archaeology to a fairly well-supported theory. These were not simple graves, but sites of what's known as excarnation and secondary burial. The dead, in this view, were not buried whole. Their bodies may have been left exposed elsewhere, to decompose, to be reduced by time and weather, perhaps even by scavenging birds, before the bones were gathered up and brought into the barrow long after death, to be sorted and placed among the community's ancestors. It's a theory that explains the physical evidence reasonably well. But it raises a deeper question that physical evidence alone can't answer. Why? Why go through such an elaborate, drawn-out process, rather than simply burying the dead as they were? What did it mean to a Neolithic farming community to wait, sometimes for months or years before bringing a person's remains to their final resting place? And what did it mean to mix those remains with others, blurring the line between individual identities and death? Some researchers have suggested this points to a worldview radically different from our own, one in which the dead were not separate ancestors so much as a collective pool of the deceased, their bones representing the community itself rather than any single life. Others have proposed the barrow may have functioned as something closer to an active ritual space, visited and reopened repeatedly over generations, rather than a tomb that was sealed and left behind, a place where the living returned, again and again, to commune with bones they themselves had placed there. Then there is the orientation. Like Maeshowe, the entrance of Stony Littleton faces a specific direction, roughly southeast, toward the rising winter sun. Whether this was a deliberate astronomical choice, tied to the solstice, or simply a practical decision shaped by the slope of the hillside, remains debated. Some researchers see in it the same impulse that drove the builders of Maeshowe and countless other Neolithic monuments across Britain and Europe, an attempt to align the world of the dead with the turning of the seasons, to root mortality itself in the larger, comforting rhythm of the sun's return each year. Skeptics caution against reading too much intention into what may be coincidence, repeated often enough across enough sites to start looking like a pattern. But the alignment is there, measurable, undeniable, even if its meaning is not. What we're left with, in the end, is a hillside in Somerset that held the sordid bones of strangers for thousands of years before anyone thought to ask what they meant. The ammonite still curls in its stone above the doorway, a fossil from one vanished age marking the entrance to a monument from another. Was Stony Littleton a tomb, a temple, a calendar, or something that doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories at all? The barrow keeps its silence, the way it always has, and the dark passage at its heart still waits, patiently, for someone to fully understand what it was built to hold. If Stony Littleton hides its chambers beneath a single, modest mound, our next destination offers something altogether more staggering. Not one tomb, but what appears to be an entire sequence of them, fused together into a single, monumental structure on a windswept peninsula in Brittany. Where the Somerset Barrow asks us to imagine generations slowly returning to the same sacred space, this site shows us, in stone, what that accumulation of time and intention can actually look like when it's left to grow for centuries. This is the Cairn of Barnenez, and it may be the oldest monumental structure on the entire planet still standing above ground. Set on a rocky promontory overlooking the Bay of Morlaix in northern Brittany, France, Barnenez is enormous. 72 meters long, 25 meters wide, rising in places to over 8 meters high. It's not a single mound but a stepped, trapezoidal cairn, its outer face built from tens of thousands of carefully stacked stones, giving it the appearance, from certain angles, of a vast stone staircase laid sideways into the hill. Walk its length today and you'll pass 11 separate entrances, each leading to its own internal passage and chamber, sealed away within the mass of the cairn like rooms in a building with no visible windows. Construction is generally dated to around 4800 BC, meaning Barnenez was already ancient, already a relic of a distant past, by the time the pyramids of Egypt or the stone circles of Britain were even conceived. The mainstream story of Barnenez is, on its surface, a fairly clear one of expansion. Archaeological excavation, carried out extensively in the 1950s after the site was nearly destroyed by quarrying, revealed that the cairn was not built in a single, unified effort. It grew. The earliest phase consists of a smaller cairn containing 5 chambers built from a pale, almost golden dolerite stone quarried locally. At some later point, how much later remains debated, with estimates ranging from a few generations to several centuries, a second phase was added, extending the structure and adding 6 more chambers, this time built largely from a different stone, a darker granite, sourced from elsewhere along the coast. The result is a monument you can, in a sense, read like a document. The seam between the 2 construction phases is still visible today, a literal line in the stone marking where one active building ended and another began. Why expand it? The conventional explanation treats this as straightforward practicality. A successful, growing community simply needed more space to house its dead, or perhaps additional lineages or family groups wished to establish their own chambers within an already significant, already sacred site. There's a logic to this that mirrors what we see at other Neolithic monuments across Europe. Sacred ground tends to attract more building, not less, as later generations seek to associate themselves with what came before. And yet the choice to use a visibly different stone for the second phase complicates any reading of pure pragmatism. If the goal were simply more space, why not match the materials, blend the addition seamlessly into the old? Instead, the builders of Phase 2 seem to have wanted the difference to be visible, a deliberate distinction preserved in the stone itself, separating old chambers from new in a way that anyone looking at the cairn could recognize. Was this a statement of lineage, distinguishing an ancestral line from newer arrivals, a record of a political or social shift within the community, or something closer to a ledger, an intentional act of history-keeping carried out not in writing, since writing did not yet exist in this part of the world, but in the simple, durable fact of mismatched stone? Inside the chambers themselves, excavators found human remains, along with pottery, stone axes and arrowheads, modest grave goods, consistent with what's been found at comparable Neolithic tombs across western France. But Barnenez held one further surprise: carvings. Several of the chamber's upright stones bear engraved symbols, U-shapes, axe motifs, wavy serpentine lines, and forms some researchers have interpreted as representing bows, or possibly the horns of cattle. These engravings predate the famous megalithic art of sites like Newgrange in Ireland by centuries, raising a quiet but persistent question. What do these symbols actually mean? Mainstream archaeology is cautious here, generally describing the carvings as likely ritual or symbolic in nature, without committing to a precise interpretation. A wavy line might represent water, or a snake, or something with no equivalent in our own visual language at all. More speculative researchers have proposed that some of the markings carry astronomical significance, possibly tracking lunar cycles or marking seasonal events, pointing to similar, though far from universally accepted, claims made about engravings at other Atlantic megalithic sites. The honest answer is that no one currently knows for certain, and the symbols carved into stone 6,800 years ago have so far declined to translate themselves. There's something almost unsettling about the scale of time involved at Barnenez. Not just the age of the monument itself, but the gap between its builders and us. When the second phase of the cairn was completed, writing had not yet been invented anywhere on Earth. The pyramids of Giza were more than 2,000 years in the future, and yet here, on a quiet headland in Brittany, a community organized itself well enough, across multiple generations, to plan, quarry, transport, and assemble tens of thousands of tons of stone into a structure that still stands largely intact today. What kind of social memory does that require? What kind of belief in continuity, in the idea that the work would matter to people not yet born, could sustain a project like that? The cairn doesn't answer. It simply continues to stand on its bay, 11 dark doorways facing the sea, holding a silence that has outlasted nearly everything else built around it. From the cold stone passages of Brittany, carved by hands that never saw a written word, we cross an ocean and an age to a desert basin in northern Mexico, to a city built not of megaliths, but of earth itself, rising from the Chihuahuan landscape in forms that still puzzle the archaeologists who study them. Where Barnenez confronts us with the sheer duration of memory, Paquimé confronts us with something different. A sophistication that seems, in certain respects, oddly out of place. A city that looks less like its closest neighbors and more like it borrowed ideas from civilizations hundreds of miles away. The ruins sit near the modern town of Casas Grandes, in the Mexican state of Chihuahua, in a river valley that has supported human settlement for thousands of years. But Paquimé itself, in the form that survives today, took shape later. Most archaeologists date its major growth to roughly 1200 to 1450 AD, making it a relatively young entry in this exploration compared to the Neolithic monuments of Europe, but no less puzzling for it. What sets Paquimé apart, even at first glance, is its construction material and method. The builders used a technique called puddled adobe, wet earth packed and built up in courses, without the wooden molds used to form individual bricks elsewhere in the region, to raise multi-story buildings, some reaching 3 or 4 stories high, honeycombed with hundreds of small rooms. Walking the site today, even in its eroded, partially reconstructed state, you can see the ghost of a genuinely urban settlement. Room blocks, plazas, platform mounds, and structures whose purposes are still argued over by the people who've spent careers studying them. Among the most striking of these are the effigy mounds, earthen platforms built in the shapes of animals, including what appears to be a serpent and a bird, likely representing macaques, whose feathers were clearly significant to the people of Paquimé in ways that go far beyond simple decoration. And that detail is where the site's deeper mystery begins to surface. Archaeologists have excavated the remains of what were almost certainly aviaries at Paquimé, structures built specifically to breed and raise scarlet macaws and military macaws, tropical birds entirely foreign to the high desert environment of Chihuahua. These are birds native to the tropical lowlands of Mexico and Central America, hundreds of miles to the south. Their bones, along with copper bells, marine shell ornaments from the Gulf of California, and ceramics bearing design motifs strikingly similar to those found in Mesoamerican cultures far to the south, have led researchers to a fairly confident conclusion. Paquimé was not an isolated community. It was a hub, a node in a trade network that stretched from the American Southwest down into the heart of Mesoamerica. This is where the mainstream and the speculative begin to blur together, not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are large. The presence of ball courts at Paquimé, playing fields associated with the Mesoamerican ball game, a ritual sport with deep religious significance across the cultures from the Maya to the Aztec, has led some archaeologists to argue that Paquimé wasn't merely trading goods with the South, but absorbing religious and political ideas as well, perhaps even hosting visiting traders or religious specialists from Mesoamerican centers. Others urge caution, noting that similar architectural features can emerge independently, and that finding macaw bones or copper bells doesn't necessarily mean direct contact with any specific southern civilization, only that objects and the ideas attached to them could travel along trade routes far more easily than people did. The honest, frustrating truth is that we don't fully know how direct that contact was, or what it actually looked like. Whether merchants from Paquimé traveled south, whether southern traders made the long journey north, or whether ideas and objects passed hand to hand across many intermediary communities, arriving transformed by the time they reach the desert. Then there's the question of the site's end. Paquimé appears to have been deliberately, even violently, destroyed sometime in the 15th century, burned, and in some areas, the bodies of its final inhabitants left where they fell, never buried. Archaeologists have found evidence consistent with a sudden, catastrophic event. Skeletal remains showing signs of trauma, sections of the city consumed by fire, abandonment that looks far more abrupt than the slow gradual decline seen at many ancient sites. Who attacked Paquimé and why remains genuinely unresolved. Was it conflict with rival groups competing for control of trade routes through the region? Internal upheaval? Some researchers have proposed climate stress, prolonged drought destabilizing a society already strained by its scale and complexity, as a contributing factor, weakening the city before whatever final event brought it down. The archaeological record can tell us that something violent happened. It cannot yet tell us, with any confidence, who was responsible or what set those final events in motion. What remains today is a landscape of low earthen walls and reconstructed room blocks, baked by the same desert sun that has shaped this valley for millennia, holding the bones of macaws that should never have been able to survive so far from their tropical home. Paquimé asks us to imagine a world far more interconnected than the desert around it might suggest. A city that looked outward, drew in ideas and goods from 1,000 miles away, and then, in a relatively short span of time, was reduced to ash and silence. Was it ambition that built Paquimé or necessity? And was it enemies, hunger, or something else entirely that finally brought it down? The macaw cages stand empty now, and the valley keeps its own counsel. From the scorched silence of a Mexican desert valley, we descend now, quite literally, into the earth itself, beneath a residential street on the island of Malta, where one of the most extraordinary structures in the prehistoric world was discovered entirely by accident, by workmen who had no idea what they were about to break into. This is the Hypogeum of Ħal-Saflieni, and unlike nearly every other site in this exploration, it isn't a mound, a tomb, or a temple built upward toward the sky. It was carved downward into solid rock over centuries, a subterranean complex that still leaves the archaeologists who study it searching for adequate words. The discovery itself in 1902 was almost incidental. Workers cutting cisterns for a new housing development in the town of Paula broke through into a void beneath the surface, and kept finding more voids beneath that one. What they had stumbled into was a multi-level complex of chambers, halls, and passages cut directly into the soft Globigerina limestone that underlies much of Malta, descending across 3 distinct levels to a depth of roughly 10 meters below the modern street. Archaeologists now estimate that construction took place in phases between roughly 4000 and 2500 BC, meaning the hypogeum was carved, expanded, and used for well over 1,000 years, a span of time longer than the gap separating us from the Roman Empire. What makes the hypogeum extraordinary isn't simply its scale, though that alone is remarkable. It's the precision and the apparent intention behind its forms. Certain chambers feature carved architectural details, false doors, trilithon entrances, and ceiling patterns painted in red ochre, including spirals and disc motifs that echo, deliberately or not, the megalithic temple architecture found above ground elsewhere on Malta, at sites like Gantija and Tarxian. In other words, the people who carved this underground complex appear to have been recreating, in solid rock, the architectural language of the freestanding temples their society was building on the surface, translating post and lintel stone construction into something carved from a single continuous mass of living rock, a technically demanding feat that required tools no more advanced than flint, stone, and antler picks. One chamber in particular has become the subject of enduring fascination. A small room known as the Oracle Room, named for an oval-shaped niche carved into one wall at the height of a standing adult. Visitors and researchers who have spoken into that niche have long reported a strange acoustic effect. A low male voice, spoken at the right pitch and angle, resonates and reverberates throughout the chamber and into adjoining rooms in a way that feels deliberately engineered rather than coincidental. Acoustic researchers who've studied the space more formally have measured resonant frequencies in the room consistent with what's sometimes called infrasound or near-infrasound range, frequencies that, in some studies elsewhere, have been associated with feelings of unease or altered perception in listeners. The mainstream archaeological position treats this as a plausible, even compelling example of intentional acoustic design. Ancient builders who understood, through accumulated trial and experience, how to shape stone to carry and amplify sound for ritual purposes. More speculative interpretations go considerably further, proposing that the chamber was purpose-built for ceremonies involving altered states of consciousness, chanting, or trance, induced in part by the very sound the space was designed to produce. What's verifiable is the acoustic effect itself. What it meant to the people who built it is a different question entirely. Then there's the matter of what and who was found inside. Excavations led primarily by archaeologist Themistocles Zamet in the early 20th century recovered the disarticulated remains of an estimated 7,000 individuals, though that number has been debated and revised over the decades since. Alongside the bones, excavators found pottery, beads, amulets, and a small number of carved figurines, including the now famous Sleeping Lady, a reclining clay figure of a full-bodied woman found resting on a miniature bed, her face turned as though in genuine sleep, rather than the rigid formality of most ancient funerary art. The sheer number of dead, combined with the apparent care given to the architecture surrounding them, has led most archaeologists to interpret the Hypogeum as a necropolis intricately tied to the temple culture above ground, a place where the dead of Malta's Neolithic temple-building society were brought, over many generations, to rest within a structure as carefully designed as any temple built in daylight. But the original excavation, more than a century ago, was conducted under far less rigorous standards than archaeology demands today, and significant portions of the site's earliest recovered material, including, reportedly, skulls that some early researchers described as unusually elongated, were lost, poorly documented, or scattered before modern analysis could be applied to them. That gap in the record has left room for genuine scientific uncertainty about some of the population that used the Hypogeum, alongside far more speculative claims that have circulated for decades, ranging from theories about ritual cranial modification which is documented in numerous other ancient cultures worldwide, to far less evidenced ideas that drift well outside what the physical evidence can support. Most serious researchers caution that without the original, well-documented remains, many of these questions may simply never be fully resolved. What survives, in the end, is the descent itself. 3 levels carved into rock by people who left behind no writing to explain their purpose, only an architecture so deliberate it still seems to be communicating something. If only we knew how to listen. Why dig downward into darkness when an entire island of temples already rose toward the open sky above them? The oracle room still holds its resonance, ready to answer anyone who speaks into it the right way, even if what it's actually saying remains, after more than a century of listening, still very much an open question. From the resonant darkness beneath Malta's streets, we rise back into daylight and travel east, to the slopes of Mount Lawu in central Java, Indonesia, where a temple unlike any other in the Hindu-Buddhist world waits among the pine trees at nearly 1,000-meter elevation. Where the Hypogeum confounds us with what was carved away, hollowed from solid stone, Candi Sukuh confounds us with what was carved onto its surfaces. Imagery so direct, so unusual for its setting, that visitors and scholars alike have spent nearly 2 centuries trying to explain exactly what they're looking at. The temple itself breaks from convention before you even reach its carvings. Most Javanese temples of the era, and there are hundreds across the island, products of centuries of Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms, follow a recognizable form. Tall, ornately tiered towers rising skyward, modeled loosely on the mountain temple traditions imported from India centuries earlier. Candi Sukuh does something different. Its main structure is a stepped, truncated pyramid, low and blocky, with a flat top rather than a soaring spire. Scholars have long noted the resemblance to Mesoamerican step pyramids thousands of miles away, a resemblance almost certainly coincidental, born of similar engineering logic rather than any historical contact, but striking enough that it's rarely left unmentioned in any serious description of the site. Construction is generally dated to the 15th century, around 1437 AD, placing it at the very end of the Majapahit Empire, the last great Hindu-Buddhist kingdom to rule significant portions of Java before the gradual spread of Islam reshaped the island's religious landscape over the following centuries. This timing matters, because Candi Sukuh sits at a genuine hinge point in Javanese history, built by a civilization that was, in some sense, already in decline, isolated geographically on the slopes of a mountain considered sacred, far from the great lowland courts and their established artistic conventions. That isolation may explain part of what makes the temple so unusual. Far from the oversight of court artisans trained in established Hindu-Buddhist iconographic traditions, the builders of Sukuh seem to have had room to create something genuinely distinct. And distinct it is. At the very entrance to the temple complex, set directly into the stone gateway, is a relief carving depicting male and female genitalia in explicit, unmistakable detail, an image so direct that for much of the 20th century, Dutch colonial authorities and later conservators kept the area roped off or downplayed in official literature, uncomfortable with displaying it openly. Mainstream archaeology generally interprets this imagery, along with other fertility-related carvings found throughout the site, as part of a coherent ritual purpose. Candi Sukuh appears to have functioned as a site associated with purification rites, possibly involving symbolic death and rebirth, with fertility imagery serving as a literal threshold. Visitors passing physically over or past these carvings as part of crossing from the ordinary world into a consecrated space. This interpretation fits within a broader pattern found in some other late Majapahit-era temples in the region, where fertility and agricultural themes appear alongside more conventional Hindu deity worship. suggesting a blending of imported religious frameworks with older indigenous Javanese beliefs centered on the land, ancestors, and the cycles of planting and harvest. But explaining the presence of this imagery doesn't fully explain its specificity or the broader iconographic program that surrounds it. Throughout the temple complex, visitors encounter reliefs depicting smithing and metalworking in striking detail. Figures operating bellows, hammering metal, working alongside what appear to be supernatural or animal-headed beings. One particularly debated relief shows a figure widely interpreted as Bhima, a hero from the Hindu epic the Mahabharata, known in Javanese tradition partly as a patron of blacksmith, shown forging a weapon inside what looks unmistakably like a smithy. Scholars generally connect this imagery to the historical and symbolic importance of metalworking in Javanese culture, where blacksmiths were sometimes regarded as figures possessing near mystical power, capable of transforming raw stone and ore into tools and weapons through fire, a process easily understood as a kind of alchemy or even creation itself. Elsewhere, the temple presents a series of relief panels whose narrative sequence remains genuinely disputed. Some panels appear to depict portions of the Sudamala story, a Javanese tale involving ritual purification and the freeing of a cursed figure from demonic transformation, fitting neatly with the purification theme suggested by the entrance carvings. Other reliefs, however, including depictions of figures with exaggerated, almost grotesque features, animals in unusual combinations, and symbols that don't clearly correspond to any known Hindu, Buddhist, or earlier Javanese mythological tradition, have resisted confident interpretation entirely. Mainstream scholarship tends to treat these as evidence of localized, syncretic religious practice, a fusion of imported Indic religion with indigenous Javanese animism and ancestor worship that simply wasn't recorded in surviving texts, leaving modern researchers to reconstruct meaning from stone alone, without the explanatory framework that contemporary written sources might have provided. More speculative interpretations have proposed everything from tantric ritual practices not openly documented elsewhere in Java to esoteric numerological or astronomical symbolism encoded in the temple's layout and orientation, though these claims remain on the margins of accepted scholarship. What's clear, walking the terraces of Candi Sukuh today, surrounded by pine forest and mountain air far removed from the grand lowland temple complexes of Borobudur or Prambanan, is that this was a place built with genuine artistic and spiritual independence, a temple unafraid to depict the human body, transformation, and craft with a directness rarely seen elsewhere in the region's religious art. Was it a final, isolated flowering of older indigenous beliefs, reasserting themselves as the great Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms of Java entered their twilight? A specialized site for initiates, encoding knowledge meant only for those who already understood its symbols. The reliefs remain in place, weathered but legible, asking each visitor who climbs the pyramid's worn steps to decide for themselves what they're truly looking at. From the pine-covered slopes of a Javanese volcano, where fertility and fire intertwined in stone, we travel now to another island entirely, one scattered not with temples but with towers, and beneath them, a different kind of monument altogether, one whose very name carries an echo of myth. This is Sardinia, and these are the Tombe dei Giganti, the giants' tombs, communal burial monuments built by the island's enigmatic Nuragic civilization, a culture that left behind thousands of structures and almost no written explanation for any of them. To understand the tombs, you first have to understand the landscape that produced them. Sardinia is home to more than 7,000 nuraghi, massive conical stone towers, built primarily of dry stone construction without mortar, that dot the island's interior in numbers found nowhere else in the prehistoric world. The Nuragic civilization that built them flourished from roughly 1800 BC until the Roman conquest of the island, a span of well over 1,000 years. And yet for a culture that left such an overwhelming physical footprint, it left behind no deciphered writing, no king lists, no myths recorded in its own words. Everything we know about Nuragic belief in society has to be reconstructed from stone, bone, and the objects buried alongside the dead. The giants' tombs are where much of that reconstruction takes place. Scattered across the island, often near clusters of nuragi, these monuments take a remarkably consistent and distinctive form. A long, narrow burial gallery, sometimes stretching 10 meters or more, fronted by a striking curved facade built from massive upright stone slabs arranged in a fan-like arc, like wings extending outward from a central doorway. At the center of that facade stands the tomb's most recognizable feature, a tall, carved stele, often shaped with a rounded top and a small, low opening near its base, just large enough for a person to crawl through to access the burial chamber within. Some of these central stones reach heights of 4 meters or more, carved from single slabs of stone and erected with a precision that, once again, raises the now familiar question of how a society without advanced lifting technology managed it so consistently across hundreds of sites for centuries. The name itself, Giants' Tombs, wasn't given by archaeologists but inherited from local Sardinian folklore, where for centuries these monuments were explained by stories of a vanished race of giants who once roamed the island and were buried within these very structures. Mainstream archaeology, of course, attributes the name to simple folk memory responding to genuine scale. These are, after all, among the largest and most imposing megalithic monuments in the Western Mediterranean, easily large enough to inspire legends of giant builders or giant occupants among later populations who had lost any direct knowledge of who actually built them. Excavated remains within the tombs do, in fact, belong to ordinary humans, interred collectively over generations, much like the long barrows of Britain, disarticulated bones, multiple individuals mixed together, suggesting these were communal ancestral monuments rather than tombs built for any single, towering individual. And yet, the folklore persists for a reason worth pausing on. Why did Sardinians across many centuries and many generations, far removed from the Nuragic builders themselves, consistently land on the explanation of giants, rather than any of the dozens of other explanations a vanished, monumental culture might inspire? Some folklorists argue this reflects nothing more mysterious than the universal human tendency to explain inexplicably massive ancient structures through tales of larger, more powerful ancestors. A pattern found in legends about megalithic sites across Europe, from giants associated with Stonehenge to similar tales tied to dolmens across the Atlantic coast. Others note that the consistency and specificity of Sardinian giant folklore, tied so precisely to these particular tombs rather than applied loosely to any old ruin on the island, suggests the legend might preserve some kernel of genuine, if badly distorted memory, perhaps of the impressive physical stature of certain individuals found within, or simply of the monument's construction representing feats of strength that, lacking any other explanation, could only be attributed to a stronger, larger people. This remains firmly speculative, and most serious archaeologists are cautious about reading too much literal history into folklore that may simply reflect the limits of pre-modern explanation rather than any preserved fact. The function of the tombs themselves raises further questions that excavation alone hasn't fully resolved. The small, low entrance at the base of the central stele seems deliberately restrictive, too narrow and low for easy, dignified passage, requiring anyone entering to crouch or crawl, a physical posture of submission or humility that many archaeologists interpret as ritually significant. an architectural reminder of the relationship between the living and the dead each time the tomb was reopened for a new burial or a ceremonial visit. Some researchers have proposed that the curved wing-like facade may have served as a gathering space for funerary rites conducted outside the tomb itself, the dead remaining sealed within, while the living performed rituals in the open ark before the central stone. Though without texts to confirm intent, this too remains an informed inference rather than settled fact. What's left, across the Sardinian countryside, are these long stone galleries and their fan-shaped facades, standing among nuraghi whose original purpose, fortress, temple, residence, or some combination the Nuragic people never separated into distinct categories, is itself still debated. The giants are gone, if they were ever more than legend, and the bones within the tombs belong to people of entirely ordinary stature. But the question the folklore was really asking remains intact. What kind of society builds monuments this consistent, this monumental, for well over a millennium, and leaves behind no name for itself at all? The stones stand in their wide, deliberate arcs, still facing outward, still waiting for someone to answer on the builder's behalf. From the windswept tombs of Sardinia, built by a civilization that left stone but no name, we cross the Atlantic to the high desert valleys of northwestern Argentina, where another people built a city to resist not just the passage of time, but the deliberate, sustained effort of an empire to erase them entirely. This is Quilmes, sprawled across the lower slopes of the Calchaquí Valley in Tucumán province, and its mystery isn't a question of who built it, that much is documented, but of how a people so thoroughly defeated managed to leave behind a story this complete, and why so much of it still resists easy explanation. The ruins climb the rocky hillside above the valley floor in a pattern that becomes more striking the longer you look at it. Not a single fortress, but an entire urban settlement, terraced and walled, with an estimated 5,000 structures, once housing a population that may have reached several thousand people at its height. The Quilmes people, part of the broader Diaguita cultural group, began building this settlement around the 9th century AD, gradually expanding it over the following centuries into one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian urban centers in what is now Argentina. Stone walls, some still standing waist-high or higher, divide the hillside into residential terraces, storage areas, and what appear to be ceremonial spaces, all oriented with apparent awareness of the valley's defensive geography. Sightlines that allow visibility for miles in every direction. A city built, from its very foundations, with conflict in mind. That defensive orientation proved necessary, and ultimately, even it wasn't enough. In the 15th century, the Inca Empire expanded into the region, and the Quilmes, along with other Diaguita communities, mounted a resistance that lasted for decades, a notable feat against an empire that had absorbed most of the Andes with comparative ease. The Quilmes never fully submitted to Inca rule, maintaining a degree of autonomy that few other conquered peoples in the region managed to preserve. But their real trial came later, with the arrival of the Spanish. Quilmes' resistance against Spanish colonization stretched on for roughly 130 years, an extraordinarily long campaign of guerrilla warfare and fortified defense conducted from this very hillside settlement, making it one of the longest sustained indigenous resistances against European colonization anywhere in South America. The historical record here is unusually well documented, drawn from Spanish colonial accounts that, however biased toward their own perspective, still preserve a clear narrative of sustained, organized defiance. It's what happened after that resistance finally broke in 1667 that carries the site's heaviest weight. Following their defeat, the surviving Quilmes population, by most estimates around 2,000 people, were forcibly marched over 1,000 kilometers to a relocation settlement near what is now Buenos Aires, in a forced displacement that colonial administrators intended, quite explicitly, as a means of breaking the community's ability to ever resist again. The journey and its aftermath were catastrophic. Disease, exhaustion, and the trauma of displacement devastated the relocated population. By some accounts, only a small fraction of those forced to march survived more than a few decades in their new location. The descendant community gave its name, eventually, to a city near Buenos Aires that still bears it today. A strange, quiet inversion in which the name Quilmes became more widely known across Argentina through a city and even a popular beer brand than through the ruins of the mountain settlement the name actually originated from. This is where the documented history gives way to genuine, ongoing questions. With the Calchaquí Valley settlement largely emptied of its original population by force, the physical site of Quilmes was left abandoned for centuries, its stone walls slowly succumbing to erosion and the encroachment of the surrounding desert vegetation. When archaeological interest in the ruins began in earnest in the 20th century, much of what survived had to be carefully reconstructed from fragmentary remains, and that reconstruction itself has become a point of ongoing debate. A significant restoration effort in the 1970s, conducted under Argentina's military government, rebuilt substantial portions of the site's walls and structures, drawing criticism from some archaeologists and from members of the present-day Quilmes descendant community, who have argued that the reconstruction reflects modern assumptions about Diaguita architecture more than verified archaeological evidence, potentially obscuring as much of the original settlement's true form as it claims to reveal. How much of what visitors see today accurately reflects the city as it stood in the 17th century, and how much is informed guesswork layered over genuine ruins, remains a question without a fully settled answer. There are deeper, more specific mysteries embedded in the site as well. Archaeologists have noted sophisticated water management systems built into the settlement's terraces, channels, and reservoirs designed to capture and distribute the limited rainfall of this arid valley across the growing season. Evidence of agricultural engineering well suited to a difficult environment. But the full extent of Quilmes' political and social organization before Inca and Spanish contact remains harder to reconstruct. Were the thousands of structures on this hillside home to a centralized authority or a looser confederation of related family groups? Did the elaborate defensive architecture reflect constant warfare even before European arrival, or a more occasional, seasonal kind of conflict with neighboring valley communities? Without surviving written records from the Quilmes themselves, much of this has to be inferred from stone foundations, scattered pottery, and the colonial accounts of people who had every reason to characterize their adversaries in particular, often unflattering ways. Today, descendants of the Quilmes diaspora, centered largely around the city near Buenos Aires that carries their ancestors' name, have engaged in ongoing efforts to reconnect with the original mountain site, including legal and cultural campaigns regarding its management and interpretation. The hillside ruins remain, terraced and walled, looking out over the same valley they were built to defend for over 6 centuries. What was daily life like in a city built explicitly to outlast siege after siege? And what precisely was lost in that forced march east? Not just in lives, but in knowledge, memory, and meaning, that no reconstruction of stone walls can ever fully restore. The valley keeps that accounting to itself. From the hillside fortress of Quilmes, built to resist empires that eventually came anyway, we travel further into the Andes, climbing to nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, onto a windswept plain near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca. The air here is thin enough to leave newcomers lightheaded within minutes, and yet a civilization once built one of the most enigmatic structures in the Americas at this exact punishing altitude. This is the Akapana, the great earthen pyramid at the heart of Tiahuanaco, and despite a century of serious archaeological study, it remains, in significant ways, only partially understood. Tiahuanaco itself was once the center of a powerful civilization that dominated the southern Andes for centuries, reaching its height roughly between 500 and 1000 AD, well before the rise of the Inca Empire that would later absorb much of its territory, and, by some accounts, its cultural memory. At its peak, Tiahuanaco may have housed tens of thousands of people, supported by an agricultural system of raised fields and canals so effective that some have been studied and revived by modern farmers in the region. But at the center of this city stood the Akapana, a stepped pyramid roughly 200 meters along each side and originally rising some 16 meters in height. Though today it appears, to the casual visitor, as little more than a grass-covered hill, its true form obscured by centuries of erosion, looting, and the systematic removal of its stone facing by later builders who repurposed the material for colonial-era construction in nearby towns. That disguise is, in itself, part of what makes the Akapana such a persistent subject of inquiry. When archaeologists began seriously excavating the structure in the 20th century, they uncovered evidence of a far more sophisticated design than its current eroded silhouette suggests. The pyramid was built in 7 distinct stepped terraces, faced originally with finely cut andesite and sandstone blocks, some fitted together with a precision reminiscent of the famous polygonal masonry found at sites like Sacsayhuaman in Peru, built centuries later by the Inca, who many researchers believe drew direct inspiration from Tiahuanaco's engineering traditions. But the most striking discovery lay within the pyramid's core, an elaborate, deliberately engineered system of internal stone-lined channels and drains built into the structure itself, designed to carry water down through the pyramid's terraces in a controlled, channeled descent. Why build something resembling a water management system into the heart of a monumental pyramid? The mainstream archaeological interpretation centers on ritual and cosmology rather than practical drainage alone. Many researchers believe the Akapana was designed to evoke a sacred mountain, a common motif throughout Andean religious thought, in which mountains were regarded as living, powerful entities, sources of water and fertility, deserving of reverence and ritual engagement. Under this interpretation, the internal channels would have allowed water, likely collected from rainfall or fed from an external source, to flow down through the pyramid's terraced levels in a way that visually and symbolically mimicked the flow of water down a natural mountainside, transforming the Akapana from a simple platform into something closer to an artificial sacred peak, engineered to perform, on command, the same life-giving function attributed to the real mountains visible on the horizon around Tiahuanaco. It's a compelling theory, supported by the broader pattern of mountain reverence found throughout Andean archaeology and ethnohistory, and most researchers find it the most plausible explanation currently available. And yet the engineering itself raises questions that the ritual interpretation doesn't fully resolve. Constructing a precisely controlled water channel system within a monumental earthen and stone structure, at this altitude, using technology that did not include metal tools or the wheel, required an understanding of hydraulics, structural engineering, and stone cutting that continues to impress specialists who've studied comparable systems. Some of the stonework recovered from the site, particularly large blocks found near the pyramid's base, weigh many tons and appear to have been transported from quarries a considerable distance away, a logistical challenge that, much like similar questions raised at megalithic sites across the world, has never been fully and uncontroversially explained in terms of the specific methods used. Mainstream archaeology generally proposes large-scale coordinated labor, log rollers, ramps, and possibly llama-drawn sledges as plausible means of transport, consistent with what's known about Andean civilizations more broadly. More speculative voices have questioned whether Tiahuanaco's builders possessed engineering knowledge beyond what's typically credited to a civilization without writing in the conventional sense, though most serious researchers regard the achievement as impressive, but well within the demonstrated capabilities of large, organized Andean societies, rather than evidence of anything beyond the historical record. The summit of the Akapana held its own surprises. Excavations there uncovered the remains of what appears to have been a sunken courtyard at the pyramid's top, along with evidence of human and animal remains, including dismembered human bodies, found in contexts that suggest ritual sacrifice rather than conventional burial. A sobering reminder that the same monument engineered to evoke a life-giving sacred mountain may also have been the site of its civilization's most severe and final rites. Why these sacrifices took place, what specific circumstances called for them, and how regularly such practices occurred over the pyramid's centuries of use remain genuinely unresolved questions, complicated further by the disturbed, looted state much of the upper structure was found in by the time professional archaeologists arrived. Today, the Akapana still rises from the altiplano as a grass-covered mound, its original stone facing long since stripped away and scattered into the walls of colonial Bolivian churches and houses. Its true engineered form preserved mostly in the patient work of excavation rather than visible to the eye. What did it mean to the people of Tiahuanaco to build an artificial mountain, channel water through its core, and bring both life and death to its summit in the same sacred space? At nearly 13,000 feet, with the wind moving steadily across the altiplano and the real snow-capped mountains visible in the distance, the Akapana keeps holding its shape, bare, eroded, and still asking to be fully understood. From the wind-scoured altiplano of Bolivia, where a civilization built an artificial mountain to channel water and ritual alike, we descend now to gentler ground, to the fertile plain of Thessaly in central Greece, where, on a low hill above a small modern village, archaeologists uncovered something that quietly rewrote the timeline of European civilization itself. This is Sesklo, and while it lacks the soaring scale of a pyramid or the haunting acoustics of an underground chamber, what it represents may be more significant than either: the earliest sustained evidence of organized village life on the European continent. A settlement so old that, for decades after its discovery, researchers struggled to fully accept what the evidence was telling them. The site sits on a modest rise known as Castraki, overlooking the Thessalian plain near the modern town of Sesklo, not far from the city of Volos. There's nothing immediately monumental about it. No towering structure dominates the skyline. No carved facade announces its significance from a distance. What Sesklo offers instead is depth. Layer upon layer of continuous habitation, excavated first in the late 19th century by the Greek archaeologist Christos Tsountas, and studied extensively ever since, revealing a settlement occupied from roughly 6850 BC through the early Bronze Age, a span of habitation stretching across nearly 5,000 years on the same patch of ground. The earliest layers, belonging to what archaeologists call the Aceramic or pre-pottery Neolithic phase, predate the introduction of pottery to the region entirely, placing Sesklo among the very first farming communities to take root in Europe, arriving from the Near East through routes still actively debated by researchers today. What makes Sesklo genuinely remarkable isn't simply its age, but its organization. Excavations revealed a settlement of small, rectangular houses, built from mud brick on stone foundations, arranged with a degree of planning that surprised early archaeologists accustomed to viewing Neolithic communities as loosely organized clusters of dwellings. By the later phases of occupation, the settlement had grown into what some researchers describe as proto-urban in character, an acropolis area at the settlement's highest point, seemingly reserved for larger, more substantial buildings, Surrounded by an extensive lower town spreading across the surrounding slopes, the whole community estimated to have housed several hundred people at its height, possibly more. For a settlement this early, predating not just the famous Bronze Age palaces of Greece, but the very invention of writing anywhere in the eastern Mediterranean, the degree of spatial organization at Sesklo raises a question that's never been fully settled. Was this organic growth, shaped gradually by generations of incremental decisions, or evidence of deliberate, centralized planning by some form of early communal authority? The mainstream view leans toward the former, a settlement whose order emerged from shared cultural practice and accumulated tradition rather than top-down design. But the consistency of certain features across the site has kept the question genuinely open. Among Sesklo's most debated structures is a building excavated at the settlement's Acropolis, distinguished from surrounding domestic houses by its larger size and more substantial construction, that some archaeologists have proposed served as a residence for a community leader, or, alternatively, as a shared meeting space used for collective decision-making or ritual purposes. The evidence doesn't conclusively support either interpretation over the other, and the building has become something of a quiet symbol for a larger uncertainty hanging over Sesklo as a whole. At what point exactly does a large farming village become something we'd recognize as a more complex, stratified society, with distinct social roles and perhaps emerging hierarchy? Sesklo sits frustratingly close to that threshold without giving a definitive answer either way. The material culture recovered from the site adds further texture to the mystery without resolving it. Sesklo gave its name to an entire culture and ceramic tradition, Sesklo ware, recognized by its painted geometric designs in red and white, considered some of the most sophisticated pottery produced anywhere in Neolithic Europe at the time. Alongside the pottery, excavators recovered an abundance of clay figurines, predominantly female, many emphasizing wide hips and pronounced bellies, broadly similar in style to figurines found across numerous other Neolithic sites throughout southeastern Europe and Anatolia. For much of the 20th century, these figurines were confidently interpreted by many archaeologists as evidence of a widespread mother goddess fertility cult, a single coherent religious tradition stretching across the Neolithic Mediterranean and Near East. That interpretation, while still influential in popular discussion, has been substantially complicated by more recent scholarship, which points out that the figurines vary considerably in form and context across different sites and may represent a much wider range of purposes: ritual offerings, ancestor representations, teaching tools, or even children's objects, rather than a single, unified religious symbol spanning thousands of kilometers and centuries. The honest position, held by most current researchers, is that we simply don't have direct access to what these figurines meant to the people who made them, and that the confident, singular goddess cult narrative may say more about 20th century interpretive assumptions than about Neolithic belief itself. Sesklo's eventual transformation adds one more layer of debate. Toward the end of the Sesklo culture's florescence, around 5800 BC, evidence suggests the settlement experienced significant disruption. Some researchers point to indications of fire and destruction layers in parts of the site, raising the possibility of conflict, internal upheaval, or external pressure from other groups entering the region. Following this period, settlement patterns across Thessaly shift, giving rise to what archaeologists term the Bimini culture, named for another nearby site, marked by different architectural styles, including settlements enclosed by concentric stone walls, suggesting either a genuine cultural rupture or a more gradual evolution, whose exact mechanism remains debated. Was the transition from Sesklo to Bimini culture driven by invasion, internal social transformation, climatic pressure on agricultural yields, or some combination the archaeological record can't fully untangle? Excavators have found enough disruption to take the question seriously, but not enough conclusive evidence to settle it definitively. What Sesklo ultimately offers isn't the singular dramatic riddle of a sealed tomb or an unexplained alignment, but something perhaps more profound. A window into the earliest moments when humans in Europe first committed themselves to permanence. To building houses meant to outlast a single generation, to organizing space with apparent intention, to creating objects whose meaning they understood completely, and which we can now only approach through careful, humble inference. The hill at Castrati still rises gently above the Thessalian plain, its layers of habitation stacked one atop another like sediment recording 5,000 years of human decisions we can trace in stone and clay, but can no longer fully hear explained in anyone's own words. What was it exactly that allowed this particular hillside to sustain a community for so impossibly long, while so many other early settlements rose and faded within a few generations? Sesklo's depth offers no single answer, only the accumulated, patient evidence of people who chose, again and again, across centuries to stay. From the patient, layered hillside of Sesklo, where a community chose permanence again and again across 5,000 years, we return to Sardinia, the same island that gave us the giants' tombs of the Nuragic Age, though we travel now much further back in time, to an earlier people who carved their dead not into freestanding stone monuments, but directly into the living rock of the earth itself. This is the necropolis of Anghelu Ruju, near the coastal town of Alghero, and it represents one of the largest and most complex collections of rock-cut tombs anywhere in the prehistoric Mediterranean. A sprawling underground city of the dead whose carved chambers still raise more questions than they answer. The necropolis was discovered in 1903, again largely by accident, when quarrying work in the area exposed openings into what turned out to be an extensive network of subterranean tombs, cut into the soft local limestone. Excavation over the following decades revealed a staggering total of 38 separate tombs, collectively forming one of the largest necropolises of its kind in the Western Mediterranean. These tombs belong to a type known across Sardinia as Domus de Janas, literally House of the Fairies or House of the Witches in the local Sardinian language. A folk name, much like the giants of the later Nuragic tombs, that reflects centuries of local communities encountering these mysterious carved chambers and reaching for the supernatural to explain what they couldn't otherwise account for. The tombs at Anghelu Ruju were carved and used over an extended period, beginning around 3300 BC and continuing in use, with various modifications and additions for well over 1,000 years, spanning the late Neolithic and into the early Bronze Age, meaning the necropolis was already ancient, already layered with centuries of accumulated dead, by the time later Sardinians began building the famous giants' tombs and nuraghi explored earlier in this series. What sets Anghelu Ruju apart from simpler rock-cut tombs found elsewhere is the sheer architectural ambition carved into its chambers. Many of the tombs go far beyond simple hollowed-out rooms, featuring multiple interconnected chambers arranged around a central space, with carved architectural details that deliberately imitate the timber-framed houses the builders likely lived in above ground. False roof beams carved in relief across the ceiling, carved door frames, and, in some chambers, low benches or shelves cut directly from the surrounding rock, apparently intended to hold the bodies of the dead or accompanying grave goods. This technique of carving domestic architectural features into a tomb meant for the dead is a pattern echoed at rock-cut necropolises elsewhere in the Mediterranean and Near East across various periods, and it raises a recurring question that anthropologists and archaeologists have long debated. When ancient builders constructed houses for their dead, Were they expressing a literal belief that the deceased continued some form of domestic existence in the afterlife, requiring shelter much as the living did? Or was this architectural mimicry more symbolic, a way of asserting continuity between the world of the living and the realm of ancestors, using a familiar visual language to make an unfamiliar, frightening transition feel more comprehensible? The carved beams and door frames don't answer the question themselves. They simply make clear that whatever the builders believed, they believed it strongly enough to invest enormous labor into making the dead feel, in some sense, at home. Several of the tombs at Anghelu Ruju contain carvings that go beyond simple architectural mimicry into more explicitly symbolic territory. Bull horns, or tauren motifs, appear carved into multiple tomb chambers throughout the necropolis, a recurring symbol found at numerous other prehistoric Mediterranean sites and widely associated by archaeologists with themes of strength, fertility, and possibly specific deity worship, though the exact belief system attached to the symbol in Sardinia specifically remains unrecorded and therefore open to interpretation. In certain tombs, these carved horns appear directly above or flanking the entrance to burial chambers, positioned in a way that seems deliberately protective or invocatory, as though standing guard over the threshold between the world of the living and the space reserved for the dead. Other chambers contain carved spirals and geometric motifs whose meaning is even less clear, echoing similar abstract symbols found at megalithic sites across Western Europe, from the passage tombs of Ireland to the chambered cairns explored earlier in Brittany, raising the broader, still unresolved question of whether these recurring symbols reflect some form of shared symbolic vocabulary that traveled along prehistoric trade and migration routes across the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, or whether strikingly similar shapes simply emerged independently among different Neolithic communities, working with comparable tools and comparable instincts about what felt meaningful to carve. The excavated remains within the tombs tell their own complicated story. Archaeologists recovered the skeletal remains of hundreds of individuals across the necropolis's 38 chambers, along with an extensive collection of grave goods, pottery vessels, including finely decorated examples attributed to the Oziri culture that dominated Neolithic Sardinia during much of the necropolis's earliest period of use, stone tools, obsidian blades likely sourced from volcanic deposits elsewhere in the Western Mediterranean, and personal ornaments including beads and pendants. The presence of obsidian in particular points to trade networks extending beyond Sardinia itself, connecting the island's Neolithic communities to broader Mediterranean exchange routes even at this early date. But as with so many of the communal tombs explored throughout this series, the remains within Anghelu Ruju were frequently found disturbed, mixed, and incomplete. The result both of the tomb's long periods of active reuse across many centuries and of disruption from later activity, including reuse of some chambers well into the Bronze Age by entirely different cultural groups who left behind their own distinct grave goods alongside, or sometimes directly atop, the original Neolithic burials. This layering complicates any clean reconstruction of exactly how the necropolis functioned at any single point in its long history, whether tombs were associated with specific families maintained across many generations, reserved for particular social roles, or opened more broadly to the wider community as needed. What remains today, in the low limestone hills outside Alghero, is a landscape honeycombed with doorways leading into darkness, each one opening onto rooms carved to resemble homes for people who would never again need shelter from rain or cold, only from forgetting. The bullhorns still stand guard over thresholds whose original meaning has long since slipped from memory, and the carved beams still arch overhead in chambers that held the Sardinian dead through more than 1,000 years of changing custom and belief. Why did Neolithic builders feel compelled to recreate the architecture of daily life inside the architecture of death so precisely, so consistently, across dozens of separate chambers carved over so many generations? Anghelu Ruju doesn't answer. It simply waits in the rock. One more underground city built for the dead, asking the living who still walk its passages to imagine what it once meant to come home. From the carved underground chambers of Sardinia, where the dead were given homes shaped like the houses of the living, we travel now to Southeast Asia, to the rolling highlands of the Xianghuang Plateau in Laos, where a different kind of funerary mystery sits scattered openly across the landscape, in plain sight, under open sky. This is the Plain of Jars, and despite its name suggesting something almost domestic, what waits here is one of the most genuinely unresolved archaeological puzzles in all of Asia. Thousands of massive stone vessels, carved and placed across hundreds of square kilometers by a civilization that left behind almost nothing else to identify itself. Scattered across more than 90 known sites throughout the province, the jars themselves are immediately, almost absurdly, imposing. Carved from solid stone, primarily sandstone, though some sites contain jars cut from granite or limestone, they range in size from roughly 1 meter to over 3 meters in height, with some of the largest specimens weighing several tons. Most are cylindrical, narrowing slightly at the base, with rims that suggest many once held lids, though only a small handful of carved stone lids have ever actually been recovered, leaving open the question of what most of the jars were originally covered with, if anything at all. They sit in clusters across the plateau, sometimes a handful together, sometimes hundreds clustered across a single hillside, weathered by centuries of monsoon rain and tropical sun. Their surfaces softened, but their basic, deliberate forms still unmistakably intentional. Radiocarbon dating and associated archaeological material place the jar's creation broadly within the Iron Age, with the most commonly cited range falling somewhere between 500 BC and 500 AD, though some researchers argue for an even earlier start date based on associated burial evidence found at certain sites. That range itself reflects one of the central frustrations of studying the Plain of Jars. The people who carved and placed them left behind no writing, no clearly identifiable settlements directly associated with jar construction, and no oral tradition among later populations that can be confidently traced back to the original builders with any specificity. Local Lao legend offers its own explanation. A story of a giant king named Kun Chung, who supposedly created the jars to brew and store enormous quantities of rice wine in celebration of a military victory. It's a vivid, memorable story, and like the giant folklore attached to Sardinia's megalithic tombs explored earlier in this series, it likely reflects local communities reaching for an explanation grand enough to match the scale of what they found, rather than preserving any literal historical memory of the actual builders. The mainstream archaeological interpretation, built up gradually over more than a century of intermittent study, treats the jars as funerary in purpose, closely tied to mortuary practices similar in concept to those seen at Stony, Littleton, and other sites explored throughout this series. Excavations conducted at several jar sites have recovered human remains in the surrounding soil, along with grave goods including beads, ceramics, and bronze and iron objects, leading researchers to propose that the jars functioned as part of a secondary burial practice. Bodies possibly exposed or otherwise allowed to decompose elsewhere, with bones eventually gathered and either placed within the jars themselves or buried in the ground immediately surrounding them. The jars serving as monumental markers for a burial landscape rather than simple storage containers as their shape might initially suggest. This interpretation has gained considerable support from more recent excavations. including extensive work conducted in the 2010s and 2020s that used direct dating methods on burial remains found beneath and around several jars, generally confirming a strong association between the jar sites and human burial practices spanning many centuries. But significant gaps remain, and they're not minor ones. Despite the funerary association now well documented at numerous sites, archaeologists still haven't definitively established who, exactly, the jar builders were. Whether they represented a single unified culture spread across the plateau, or a looser network of related communities sharing common funerary practices without necessarily sharing a single political or ethnic identity. The settlements where these people actually lived day to day have proven remarkably elusive. Unlike many of the funerary sites explored elsewhere in this series, where tombs sit near clearly identifiable villages or towns, the jar sites of Laos have so far yielded little direct evidence of the substantial residential communities that surely must have existed nearby to support such an extensive, labor-intensive stoneworking tradition. Where did these people actually live? Why does the landscape preserve their monuments to death so extensively while concealing almost everything about their daily lives? There's also the matter of the quarries themselves and the sheer logistics the jars represent. Identified quarry sites for the stone used in jar construction are, in several cases, located a considerable distance from where the finished jars were ultimately placed, sometimes many kilometers away, across terrain that would have made moving multi-ton stone vessels an enormous undertaking without draft animals suited to the task or any evidence of wheeled transport technology in the region during this period. As with megalithic transport questions raised at other sites throughout this exploration, from Stonehenge to the Andes, archaeologists generally propose labor-intensive but technologically plausible solutions: log rollers, ramps, large coordinated human labor forces, while acknowledging that the precise methods used and the social organization required to mobilize that labor across what may have been a loosely connected network of communities rather than a centralized state remain genuinely uncertain. The site's modern history has added its own layer of obstruction to understanding it. The Xianghoang Plateau sits within an area heavily bombed during the Vietnam War era, when Laos became, by total tonnage, the most heavily bombed country in history relative to its population. Much of that ordnance falling directly across the Plain of Jars region due to its strategic location. Unexploded ordnance still litters significant portions of the landscape today, and large-scale, systematic archaeological survey of the full extent of jar sites has only become safely possible in relatively recent years, following extensive, ongoing clearance efforts. This means that even now, in the 21st century, researchers strongly suspect that additional jar sites, and quite possibly crucial evidence about the settlements and society that produced them, remain undiscovered or inaccessible, hidden not by time alone, but by the more recent, tragic layering of conflict atop an already ancient mystery. What stands today across the Xianghoang Plateau, then, is a landscape openly displaying thousands of monuments whose builders chose visibility over concealment, scale over subtlety, and yet who somehow still managed to remain almost entirely anonymous to the people now working to understand them. The jars sit weathered and open to the sky, holding rainwater where lids once may have sealed them shut, scattered across hillsides that may yet hold villages, workshops, or answers still waiting beneath the soil. Who were the people confident enough to carve stone on this scale, and humble enough to leave behind no name we've ever recovered? The plain keeps its silence, jar after empty jar, across a landscape still being slowly, carefully reclaimed from both centuries past and a far more recent war. From the open, sky-facing jars of the Laotian highlands, we travel south and west across the Pacific to the Peruvian Andes, to a hillside near the town of Abancay, where a single carved boulder has puzzled visitors for centuries with a level of detail that seems, at first glance, almost impossibly intricate for stone. This is the Sayhuite stone, sometimes called the stone labyrinth. And unlike the monumental scale of so many sites explored throughout this series, its mystery lies not in its size, but in the sheer, obsessive density of what's been carved into its surface, a miniature world rendered in granite that archaeologists still aren't entirely certain how to read. The stone itself sits within a larger archaeological complex known as Sayhuite or Sayhuite, located at roughly 3,500 meters elevation in the Apurimac region of Peru, along what was once a significant route connecting Cusco, the heart of the Inca Empire, to territories further west. The main boulder, a massive piece of diorite measuring roughly 4 meters in length, dominates the site, its rounded surface almost entirely covered in low-relief carvings depicting an extraordinarily detailed miniature landscape. Terraced fields, irrigation channels, ponds, rivers, and what appear to be roads wind across the stone's surface in carved relief, alongside more than 200 carved figures representing animals, including pumas, monkeys, llamas, snakes, frogs, and lizards, along with human figures and architectural forms that some researchers have interpreted as small-scale representations of buildings or fortresses. The conventional, well-supported archaeological dating places the stone's carving within the Inca period, most likely sometime in the 15th or early 16th century, during the empire's height before Spanish conquest. This attribution rests on reasonably solid ground. The broader Sayhuite complex includes other clearly Inca architectural features, including stepped platforms and finely cut masonry, consistent with known Inca construction techniques found throughout the empire, and the carved landscape's emphasis on terraced agriculture and water management closely mirrors agricultural engineering the Inca were demonstrably skilled at implementing across the rugged terrain of the Andes. Many archaeologists interpret the stone, under this framework, as a kind of relief map or model, possibly used for ritual purposes connected to water worship, agricultural fertility rites, or as a teaching or planning tool related to the very terracing and irrigation systems the Inca were famous for engineering across their empire. Water, in particular, held deep ceremonial significance in Andean religious thought, and the carved channels on the stone, some researchers note, may once have been used to direct actual water across its surface during ceremonies, the liquid running through the miniature rivers and ponds carved into the granite in a kind of functioning ritual landscape, small enough to hold in view all at once, yet detailed enough to represent the empire's relationship with the land in miniature. That interpretation, however, doesn't fully satisfy everyone who has studied the stone closely, and the reasons for hesitation are worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. The sheer precision and density of the carving, achieved using tools generally understood to have been bronze, stone, and possibly some limited use of other materials, has led some researchers and visitors to question whether the surviving stonework fully matches what's typically documented elsewhere in confirmed Inca relief carving. Compared to other well-attested examples of Inca stone carving, the level of detailed, small-scale figurative work on the Sayhuite stone is unusually extensive, raising questions about how much specialized skill or how many carving hours such a piece would have required, and whether that effort fits comfortably within what's otherwise known about Inca artistic production and priorities during this relatively short imperial period. Most archaeologists who've directly studied the site maintain that the carving, while exceptional, remains consistent with Inca capability, particularly given the empire's well-documented mastery of monumental stonework at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu. But the stone's exceptional, almost outlier quality compared to other surviving Inca relief work has kept a thread of genuine scholarly curiosity, and separately, a good deal of more speculative fringe theorizing, alive around the question of exactly how and by whom every detail was carved. Adding to the puzzle is the stone's condition and history following the Spanish conquest. Colonial-era accounts and later visitor records indicate that significant portions of the carved relief were deliberately damaged sometime after the conquest, likely by Spanish colonial authorities or missionaries who viewed the stone's imagery, and quite possibly the ongoing indigenous rituals associated with it, as a threat requiring suppression, a pattern of deliberate destruction documented at numerous indigenous sacred sites across the Americas during the colonial period. Sections of the carved landscape appear to have been chiseled away or otherwise defaced, meaning the surviving stone, remarkable as it still is, likely represents only a partial record of its original, complete design. What was carved into those now damaged sections? Did they depict additional figures, structures, or symbolic elements that might have clarified the stone's full intended meaning? Had they survived intact? The gaps in the carving are, in their own quiet way, as informative about the site's history as the surviving relief itself. A physical record of suppression layered directly onto a physical record of indigenous engineering and belief. There's also the broader question of purpose that continues to generate genuine debate among researchers, separate from questions of authenticity or dating. Was the Sayhuite stone primarily a religious or ceremonial object, used in rituals invoking fertility and water abundance for the surrounding agricultural lands? Was it instead, or additionally, a kind of practical or symbolic map used by Inca administrators or engineers to plan, represent, or commemorate the very terracing and irrigation systems the empire depended on to feed its population across difficult mountain terrain? Or did it serve some combination of both functions, blurring a distinction between the practical and the sacred that, as we've seen at multiple sites throughout this series, from Mesopotamian ziggurats to Bolivian pyramids, may not have existed nearly as clearly in the worldview of the people who built these structures as it does in our own. What remains today, on its hillside above the Apurimac countryside, is a single extraordinary boulder, its surface still legible enough, despite centuries of damage and weathering, to convey the unmistakable impression of an entire world carved in miniature. Fields, waters, animals, and structures, all rendered in patient, exacting relief by hands whose precise identity and full intention we can reconstruct only partially from the evidence that survived deliberate effort to erase it. Was Sayhuite a map, a temple, a teaching tool, or something that combined all three functions seamlessly in a way modern categories struggle to capture? The damaged sections of the stone keep their secrets in the absence they've left behind, and the surviving carvings continue to ask, in patient granite detail, more questions than even a century of study has managed to fully answer. From the carved miniature world of the Sayhuite stone, where an entire landscape was rendered small enough to hold in a single glance, we travel north and east, across the Pacific and deep into the steppes of southern Russia, near the border with Kazakhstan, where a settlement laid out with startling geometric precision was discovered not by patient excavation, but by satellite photography and the threat of a reservoir flood. This is Arkaim, and it remains one of the most debated archaeological sites of the 20th century. Not primarily because of what was found within it, but because of what later observers, often with agendas far removed from archaeology itself, have chosen to make of it. Arkaim was identified in 1987 during a survey of the Chelyabinsk region ahead of planned construction of a hydroelectric reservoir that would have flooded the site entirely. Aerial photographs revealed something unusual beneath the grass-covered steppe: the unmistakable outline of two concentric circular walls, precisely laid out, with a clear radial street pattern dividing the interior into wedge-shaped residential sections, all oriented around a central open square. Archaeologists, led by Genadij Zdanovic, undertook emergency excavation, and what they uncovered was a fortified settlement dating to roughly 2100 to 1800 BC, attributed to the Sintashta culture, a Bronze Age society that occupied this region of the southern Ural steppe and is now widely recognized by archaeologists as one of the likely points of origin for the spoke-wheeled chariot, among the earliest such vehicles documented anywhere in the archaeological record. The settlement's layout is, by any measure, genuinely impressive in its planning. The outer wall, originally constructed from timber-reinforced earth and clay, formed a near-perfect circle, roughly 160 meters in diameter, enclosing an inner ring of similar construction, with somewhere between 60 and 70 individual dwelling units arranged radially between the two walls, each unit apparently sharing common structural walls with its neighbors in a continuous ring of attached housing. A network of streets, including what appears to have been a covered, partially underground drainage and roadway system running beneath portions of the settlement, allowed for sanitation and water management notably sophisticated for a community of this period and region. Archaeologists estimate the settlement may have housed several hundred to as many as 2,500 people, a population that, combined with the clear evidence of advanced metalworking, furnaces and smelting debris found throughout the site, point to organized bronze production on a meaningful scale, has led researchers to treat Arkaim as compelling evidence that Bronze Age steppe societies, often characterized in older scholarship as comparatively simple pastoral or nomadic groups, were in fact capable of organizing complex, planned, semi-urban settlements with real architectural and metallurgical sophistication. That much is broadly accepted within mainstream archaeology, and Arkaim's genuine importance to understanding Sintashta and broader Bronze Age steppe culture is not seriously disputed. The site is now recognized as part of a wider phenomenon researchers call the Country of Towns, referring to a cluster of more than 20 similar fortified circular and rectangular settlements identified across the same general region of the southern Urals, of which Arkaim is the largest and best preserved. The questions that remain genuinely open within serious scholarship tend to center on more specific, narrower issues. Why these settlements followed such consistent geometric planning principles across a fairly wide area and over multiple generations. What specific social or political structure organized labor sufficient to construct fortifications and housing of this complexity? And why, after a relatively short period of occupation, current estimates suggest Arkaim itself may have been inhabited for as little as 2 to 3 centuries before being deliberately burned and abandoned by its own residents, rather than destroyed by an outside attacker. That detail in particular has prompted real curiosity. Why would a community invest this much labor into constructing a fortified settlement, only to set fire to it themselves and move on? Researchers have proposed explanations ranging from ritual closure practices, possibly tied to funerary customs associated with the departing or relocating population, to more practical considerations like resource depletion or shifting pastoral patterns requiring the community to move its settlement. But no single explanation has achieved firm consensus. Where Arkaim's story becomes considerably more complicated is in its post-discovery reception, particularly within Russia itself. In the years following its excavation, Arkaim was adopted, with increasing intensity through the 1990s and beyond, by a range of esoteric, nationalist, and New Age movements who began promoting the site as evidence of an ancient, Aryan homeland, a supposed birthplace of Indo-European peoples imbued with mystical or even extraterrestrial significance, drawing large numbers of spiritual tourists and pilgrims to the site each year, particularly around the summer solstice. This interpretation is not supported by mainstream archaeological or linguistic scholarship, which generally situates Archaim and the broader Sintashta culture within the legitimate, well-documented academic discussion of early Indo-European and Indo-Iranian linguistic and cultural origins on the Eurasian steppe, a genuine and still actively researched field of historical linguistics and archaeology, without any of the racialized or mystical framing that later popular movements have layered onto the site. The gap between Archaim's actual, well-documented archaeological significance and the elaborate, often politically charged mythology that has grown up around it in popular culture represents its own kind of unresolved tension, one not about what the Bronze Age builders intended, but about how readily an ancient site, once excavated and made visible, can be reinterpreted by later generations to serve agendas its original builders could never have anticipated or recognized. Stripped of that later mythology, what remains at Archaim is still remarkable enough on its own terms: a precisely planned circular settlement, built by Bronze Age steppe pastoralists who also happened to be skilled metalworkers and likely among the earliest chariot builders in human history, occupied intensively for a relatively brief span before being deliberately burned and abandoned by the very people who built it. Why circular rather than the rectangular layouts found at some neighboring country of towns sites? Why such a short occupation, ended by fire set from within rather than collapse from without? And how much of what made this settlement meaningful to its own residents has been obscured rather than illuminated by the layers of later interpretation piled onto it since its rediscovery? The grass-covered steppe has closed back over much of the site's original earthworks, and Archaim continues to hold two distinct kinds of mystery at once, one rooted in genuine, unresolved archaeology, and another created entirely by the modern world's hunger to find meaning, whether earned or not, in what the steppe had kept quiet for nearly 4,000 years. From the steppe circles of Archaim, where modern mythology grew thick around a genuine, but more modest archaeological reality, we traveled to West Java, Indonesia, to a forested hilltop south of the city of Cianjur, where a similar tension between solid archaeological evidence and far more extraordinary claims has, in recent years, become one of the most publicly contentious debates in the field. This is Gunung Padang, and unlike many of the sites explored throughout this series, its mystery isn't simply a matter of unanswered questions. It's a live, ongoing scientific dispute about what exactly lies beneath the hill at all. The visible site sits atop a steep, terraced hill rising from the surrounding rice paddies and forest, reached by a long stone staircase of nearly 400 steps. At the summit, spread across 5-stepped terraces connected by stone pathways, lies an extensive arrangement of columnar basalt rock, naturally hexagonal and pentagonal stone columns, formed through volcanic cooling processes that have been deliberately gathered, arranged, and in some cases stacked by human hands into walls, platforms, and what appear to be the foundations of structures. This much is not seriously disputed. Gunung Padang is, at minimum, a genuine and substantial megalithic site, the largest of its kind known in Indonesia, and Indonesian archaeologists have studied its surface terraces for decades, generally dating the visible megalithic construction to sometime within the last few thousand years, likely associated with later prehistoric or early historic Indonesian megalithic traditions, broadly comparable in spirit, if not in exact form, to other terraced ceremonial sites found across the archipelago, including aspects of the Sukuh temple explored earlier in this series. Where Gunung Padang departs sharply from a typical, well-supported archaeological narrative is in a series of claims that emerged more prominently over the past 2 decades, centered on the idea that the visible megalithic terraces represent only the uppermost, most recent layer of a far older, far larger, and possibly entirely artificial structure buried within the hill itself. This theory is most closely associated with Indonesian geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaja, who led a series of investigations at the site beginning in the 2010s, employing techniques including ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity surveys, and core drilling samples taken from deep within the hill. Based on this research, Natawijeja and his team proposed that Gunung Padang contains multiple distinct layers beneath its visible surface, including buried chambers, and what they interpreted as deliberately shaped construction material, with radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from these deeper layers producing remarkably old age estimates. Claims that portions of the buried structure could date back as far as 16,000 to even 27,000 years, which, if accurate, would make Gunung Padang dramatically older than any other confirmed monumental construction anywhere on Earth, predating even the very earliest agricultural societies by many thousands of years. These claims, published most prominently in a 2023 paper in the journal Wiley Advances in Archaeological Practice, generated enormous international attention, including significant popular media coverage that often presented the extreme dating as a confirmed, paradigm-shifting discovery rather than a contested hypothesis. The response from the broader archaeological community was swift and largely critical. A substantial number of archaeologists and geologists raised serious methodological objections to the research, arguing that the radiocarbon dating, while accurately measuring the age of organic material, such as soil and buried plant matter found within the hill, did not actually establish that this material was associated with deliberate human construction at all. Critics pointed out that the layers identified through ground-penetrating radar and drilling could plausibly represent entirely natural geological formations, the product of volcanic processes and subsequent erosion shaping the columnar basalt over tens of thousands of years, with organic materials simply settling and becoming buried within natural soil layers over an extended period, unrelated to any human building activity. In essence, the core scientific objection was that dating old soil within a hill does not, by itself, prove that humans shaped the hill at that same ancient date. The two pieces of evidence, critics argued, had not been convincingly linked. This controversy escalated further in 2024, when the publishing journal formally retracted the 2023 paper, citing concerns about the scope of the conclusions drawn relative to the supporting evidence, alongside questions about the interpretation of the radar and drilling data as representing genuine man-made structures rather than natural geological strata. The retraction does not, it's worth being precise about, disprove that human activity occurred at Gunung Padang at some point in deep prehistory, nor does it necessarily invalidate every individual radiocarbon date obtained from the site. What it does reflect is a scientific consensus that the specific claim that an enormous, deliberately constructed megalithic structure, tens of thousands of years old, lies buried within the hill, was not adequately demonstrated by the evidence presented, and that significant further, more rigorously interpreted research would be required before such an extraordinary claim could be responsibly accepted. This leaves Gunung Padang in a genuinely unusual position within this exploration, one worth approaching with particular care. Unlike many sites where the open questions involve interpreting the meaning or purpose of structures whose existence and approximate age are not seriously disputed, Gunung Padang presents a more fundamental, currently unresolved scientific disagreement about what physical evidence even exists beneath the visible surface terraces, and what that evidence does or doesn't demonstrate. The visible megalithic site, the staircase, the terraces, the arranged basalt columns, remains a real, fascinating, and legitimately understudied piece of Indonesian archaeological heritage in its own right, regardless of how the deeper, more sensational claims are eventually resolved. Indonesian archaeological authorities have continued more conventional excavation and study at the site independent of the retracted paper's claims, working to better understand the visible terrace's construction sequence, their relationship to other Indonesian megalithic traditions, and the likely ceremonial or community functions they once served, broadly consistent with practices documented at other terraced sites across the archipelago. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to suggest the deeper questions raised by the site have been entirely closed off by the controversy. Ground-penetrating radar and core drilling did reveal genuine subsurface anomalies and layering within the hill that aren't fully explained by either side of the debate with complete certainty. The disagreement centers specifically on how to interpret that data, not on whether unusual subsurface structure exists at all. Some independent geologists have suggested that further, more carefully controlled excavation, ideally involving direct physical examination of buried features, rather than reliance on radar interpretation and dating of surrounding soil alone, could help clarify whether any portion of the hill's interior does, in fact, contain deliberately shaped or arranged material from a period substantially predating the visible surface terraces, and if so, how old that material genuinely is, and what cultural or technological context could plausibly explain its presence so deep in the past. Until and unless such work is conducted and its results subjected to the same rigorous scrutiny that ultimately led to the 2023 paper's retraction, the honest position is one of openness paired with caution. The most extreme dating claims associated with Gunung Padang have not been validated by the broader scientific community, but the underlying questions about the hill's full subsurface composition haven't been definitively closed either. What makes Gunung Padang particularly worth including in an exploration like this one isn't, ultimately, a confirmed answer in either direction. It's the case study the site provides in how extraordinary archaeological claims move through public attention, scientific scrutiny, and eventual correction, often unfolding faster in popular media than in the more careful, iterative process science actually requires to responsibly evaluate evidence. The hill itself, meanwhile, continues exactly as it has for however long its true history actually spans. Its visible terraces climbing the slope in patient stone, its basalt columns arranged by hands whose full intentions and full timeline remain, even now, the subject of genuine, unresolved investigation. Was there ever a structure beneath Gunung Padang built by people far older and more capable than current understanding of the period would generally allow? Or do the hill's deeper layers represent nothing more than the ordinary, if striking geological history of a volcanic landscape, misread under the pressure of an extraordinary hypothesis searching for confirmation? Indonesian archaeologists, and the broader international community watching the debate unfold, continue working toward an answer, and until that work concludes with evidence solid enough to withstand the scrutiny the 2023 controversy demonstrated this site demands, Gunung Padang remains exactly what its name might suggest to a visitor climbing those 400 stone steps for the first time. A mountain that may, or may not, by hiding far more than what's visible at its summit. From the contested radar data buried beneath an Indonesian hillside, we travel into shallow, sunlit water off the coast of North Bimini in the Bahamas, where one of the most famous and most disputed underwater formations in the world lies just a few meters below the surface, visible from a boat on a calm day as a long, pale line running across the seabed. This is the Bimini Road, sometimes called the Bimini Wall, and few sites in this entire exploration carry a more polarized history between mainstream science and popular imagination, largely because of a single prediction made decades before anyone ever found the formation at all. The story properly begins not with archaeology, but with prophecy. In the 1930s and 1940s, American psychic Edgar Cayce, working in a self-induced trance state he claimed allowed him to access hidden knowledge, made a series of readings in which he stated that the lost civilization of Atlantis would be found, with physical remains beginning to surface near the island of Bimini, and that this rediscovery would occur around the year 1968 or 1969. Casey died in 1945, more than 2 decades before that predicted date. But his followers and the broader community built around his teachings continued to track his prophecies closely. Then, in September 1969, a team of divers including Joseph Manson Valentine, Robert Farrow, and others reported discovering a striking underwater formation roughly half a mile off the coast of North Bimini, submerged in shallow water generally less than 6 meters deep, a structure they soon began describing, given the timing, as a remarkable fulfillment of Casey's decades-old prediction. What they found, and what remains visible today, is a linear arrangement of large, flat-topped limestone blocks, generally rectangular or polygonal in shape, extending in a path roughly 0.8 kilometers long, with the formation displaying a distinct, somewhat angular bend partway along its length, sometimes described as a J shape. The blocks themselves are substantial, many measuring several meters across, and their flat upper surfaces, combined with the visible seams and joints between adjacent stones, gave early divers and subsequent investigators the strong visual impression of a deliberately constructed pavement or roadway, or possibly the foundation remains of a wall, sitting on the shallow seabed exactly where Casey had, depending on how one interprets his original wording, seemed to suggest something significant would be found. The scientific response to the discovery, however, developed along a markedly different track. Geologists who studied the formation in subsequent decades, including detailed analysis published from the 1970s onward, generally concluded that the Bimini Road is what's known as a beach rock formation, a naturally occurring geological feature created when calcium carbonate, dissolved in groundwater moving through coastal sediment, cements layers of beach sand and shell fragments together into solid rock, typically forming along ancient shorelines. As sea levels fluctuated over thousands of years, particularly during the period following the last glacial maximum when global sea levels rose substantially, these hardened beach rock formations, originally created along what was once a dry coastline, would have become submerged as the water rose around them. Crucially, beach rock has a well-documented natural tendency to fracture along fairly regular, often near rectangular joint patterns, a product of the way the cementing process and subsequent erosion interact with the original sediment layering, meaning that a formation which looks, to an untrained eye underwater, remarkably like deliberately cut and placed paving stones can, in fact, form through entirely natural processes, with no human involvement required at all. Radiocarbon and other dating methods applied to the Bimini Formation have generally produced age estimates consistent with this natural beach rock explanation, suggesting the stones formed and were subsequently submerged within a time frame that, while still requiring further precision, falls well within the range geologists associate with sea level changes following the last ice age, a process unfolding over thousands of years, but considerably more recent and considerably more explicable than a vanished advanced civilization predating recorded history. This natural explanation has become the dominant position within mainstream geology and archaeology, and it's a position grounded in genuine, testable evidence about how beach rock forms and fractures, rather than mere dismissal. And yet the Bimini Road has never quite settled into the kind of comfortable scientific consensus that similar formations elsewhere in the world have achieved. And the reasons for that persistent uncertainty are worth examining honestly rather than waving away. Some researchers and divers who have closely examined the formation over the decades have pointed to specific features they argue sit somewhat uneasily within a purely natural explanation. including the consistency of certain block sizes, the relatively uniform thickness of many of the stones, and the presence, noted by some investigators, of what appear to be additional stones positioned beneath the primary visible layer in certain sections, sometimes described as supporting or leveling stones. A feature that, if accurately observed and verified through controlled excavation rather than visual survey alone, would be considerably harder to explain through natural beach rock fracturing, which doesn't typically produce stacked, two-tiered arrangements of this kind. Critics of the natural explanation have also pointed to the formation's distinctive angular bend as visually unusual for a beach rock formation, which tends to follow former shoreline contours in more gradual curves, though geologists who support the natural explanation note that beach rock fracture patterns can produce more varied geometries than is sometimes acknowledged, particularly where older fault lines or sediment irregularities in the underlying coastline are involved. It's also worth noting, in the interest of full context, that not every researcher who has questioned the purely natural explanation has done so from within the Atlantis-focused framework that originally brought the site to public attention. Some marine geologists and archaeologists who remain skeptical of any Atlantean association have nonetheless argued that the site deserves more rigorous, modern excavation than it has historically received, given that much of the foundational research on the formation was conducted decades ago, often by investigators working from within the Casey-influenced framework that originally motivated the search. A starting point that some critics argue may have shaped both the methodology and the interpretation of early findings in ways that more neutral, present-day archaeological techniques, including more precise stratigraphic excavation beneath and around the stones themselves, rather than primarily visual and surface-level investigation, could help resolve more definitively one way or the other. What the Atlantis framework specifically requires, in order for the Bimini Road to represent genuine evidence of an advanced lost civilization, is a level of human technological and social sophistication, combined with a date of construction extending back many thousands of years before the conventional archaeological timeline for any known monumental architecture anywhere on Earth, that the broader archaeological and geological record simply does not currently support through any independently verified evidence elsewhere in the world. This is the central reason mainstream scholarship has remained firmly skeptical of the Atlantis interpretation specifically, even while leaving somewhat more room for ongoing, narrower questions about the precise formation history of this particular site. The ambitious, civilization-defining claim and the more modest, geologically grounded uncertainty about specific structural details are, in other words, two genuinely separate questions, and it's possible to take the second seriously as worthy of further careful study while remaining appropriately cautious about the first. Today, the Bimini Road remains a popular site for recreational divers who can swim along its length in clear, shallow Bahamian water, running their hands across stones that may represent nothing more than the patient, gradual handiwork of geological time, or may, in sections not yet fully excavated and studied with the rigor modern archaeology can bring to bear, hold details that complicate the tidy natural explanation more than current evidence has yet been able to fully resolve. The formation sits exactly where Edgar Cayce's followers expected something significant to be found, a coincidence of timing and location that neither proves nor disproves anything about the stones themselves, but which has shaped the public imagination around this site more powerfully than perhaps any comparable formation anywhere else in the world. Is the Bimini Road simply beach rock, fractured by time and submerged by rising seas, its resemblance to deliberate construction an accident of geology rather than design? Or does it hold details still unaccounted for, waiting beneath layers of sand and decades of assumption for a more rigorous excavation to finally settle the question? The water above it remains calm and shallow, the stones still visible from the surface on a clear day, patient and unmoving, exactly as they've been for however long it actually turns out they've truly been there. From the shallow sunlit waters off Bimini, where geology and prophecy have spent decades arguing over the same stones, we climb now into the cloud forest of northern Peru, ascending through mist that rarely fully clears to a ridge nearly 3,000 meters above sea level in the Amazonas region. Here, hidden for centuries beneath dense vegetation that even today threatens to reclaim it, stands one of the most imposing pre-Columbian structures in all of South America, a walled citadel built by a people the Inca themselves once called the Cloud Warriors. This is Kuelap, and though it predates Machu Picchu by several centuries, it remains, even now, far less understood than its more famous southern counterpart. The fortress belongs to the Chachapoya, a confederation of cultures who occupied the steep, forested mountains of what is now northern Peru, from roughly the 8th century AD until their eventual incorporation, often violently resisted, into the expanding Inca Empire in the late 15th century, shortly before the Spanish conquest swept through the entire region. Kuelap itself, construction of which most archaeologists date to beginning around 900 AD, with continued building and modification over the following centuries, sits atop a long limestone ridge enclosed by a massive outer wall built from local limestone blocks that, in places, rises more than 19 meters in height. Taller, in places, than the outer walls of many medieval European castles, and constructed using a sophisticated dry stone technique that required no mortar to hold the immense weight of the fortification together. Inside those walls lies a settlement of genuine scale and complexity. More than 400 circular stone structures, the dominant architectural form throughout Chachapoya territory, clustered across the ridge in a layout that suggests careful, if not necessarily centrally planned, organization over generations of continuous habitation. Many of these circular buildings feature elaborate decorative friezes worked directly into their stone walls, geometric patterns including zigzags, rhomboids, and stepped designs, achieved by carefully arranging stones of slightly different shades and textures to create visual patterns across the building's exterior. A decorative technique that appears with notable consistency across numerous Chachapoya sites throughout the region, suggesting a shared artistic and possibly symbolic vocabulary, whose precise meaning, much like the carved motifs found at sites explored earlier in this series, has not survived in any written or oral tradition specific enough to translate it with confidence today. The settlement's defensive character is immediately apparent and not seriously disputed by archaeologists. Kuelap's massive walls feature only a small number of narrow, deliberately restrictive entrances, passages so narrow in places that only one or two people could pass through at a time, often built with an inward tapering design that some researchers have interpreted as a deliberate defensive funnel, forcing any attacking force into a vulnerable, single-file approach where defenders positioned above could control access far more effectively than a wide, open gateway would allow. This defensive emphasis fits within the broader historical context of the Chachapoya, as a people who, by surviving Inca and Spanish accounts, maintained a reputation for fierce, sustained resistance against outside conquest, not unlike the Quilmes resistance explored earlier in this series, though the Chachapoya Confederation's relationship with the expanding Inca state appears to have been considerably more complicated and prolonged than a single, clean narrative of conquest and resistance can fully capture. That complexity is where Kuelap's deeper, still debated questions begin to surface. Spanish chroniclers writing in the 16th century, drawing partly on local and Inca informants who themselves had only limited direct knowledge of the Chachapoya's own deeper history, described the Chachapoya in terms that have fascinated and frustrated researchers ever since. Most notably, the chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon's account describing the Chachapoya as notably fair-skinned compared to other Andean peoples he encountered. a description that has been seized upon over the following centuries by various fringe theories proposing everything from European contact predating Columbus to more elaborate claims of lost or migrating ancient populations reaching the Andes from entirely different parts of the world. Mainstream archaeology and physical anthropology have found no substantive genetic or archaeological evidence supporting these more extreme interpretations, and most scholars treat Chiesa de Leon's brief physical description with appropriate caution, noting that colonial-era chroniclers frequently made imprecise, second-hand, and sometimes embellished observations about indigenous peoples they encountered only briefly, or through translated accounts, often filtered through the perspectives and biases of Inca informants who held their own complicated, sometimes adversarial relationship with the Chachapoya as a recently conquered, historically resistant population. The genuine, scholarly position is that the Chachapoya were an indigenous Andean people, culturally and materially connected to the broader patterns of pre-Columbian South American civilization, whatever specific physical descriptions individual Spanish observers happened to record. A more substantively debated mystery concerns Kuelap's eventual fate and the population that built it. Archaeological evidence indicates the site experienced significant depopulation and was largely abandoned sometime after Spanish contact, consistent with the broader catastrophic demographic collapse experienced by indigenous populations across the Americas following European arrival, driven primarily by the introduction of diseases to which native populations had no prior immunity, compounded in many regions by displacement, forced labor, and violent conquest. What's less settled is the more specific question of Kuelap's population trajectory and social organization in the decades immediately surrounding Inca incorporation, prior to Spanish arrival. Some structures and burial evidence found at the site suggest continued, possibly even intensified, occupation during the period of Inca control, while other evidence points to disruption and partial abandonment beginning even before the Spanish conquest proper, raising open questions about exactly how the relationship between Kuelap's Chachapoya inhabitants and their Inca overlords actually functioned on a day-to-day basis, whether as a genuinely integrated provincial center, a resentfully controlled population maintaining quiet autonomy, or something that shifted unevenly across the relatively brief decades between Inca conquest of the region and the arrival of Spanish forces that would, within a generation, unravel the entire Inca imperial structure itself. Among the more striking and still debated archaeological features at Kuelap is a large, distinctive structure known as El Tintero, an inverted cone-shaped building constructed near the southern end of the settlement. Its unusual funnel-like form unlike any other structure at the site or, for that matter, unlike most other known Chachapoya architecture more broadly. Excavations beneath and within El Tintero recovered animal bones, and what some archaeologists have interpreted as evidence consistent with ritual or ceremonial use, though the structure's precise function remains genuinely unresolved. Was it a ceremonial space tied to specific religious practices, distinct from the more common circular residential buildings found throughout the rest of the settlement? A specialized storage facility, whose particular shape served some practical purpose related to grain or food preservation in the cloud forest's persistently damp climate? Or something tied more specifically to elite or priestly activity, set apart architecturally because its function was itself set apart from ordinary daily life within the fortress walls. The structure's isolation, both physically within the site and conceptually within the broader pattern of Chachapoya architecture, has kept it a point of particular interest among researchers without producing a confidently settled interpretation. The broader question of who, precisely, the Chachapoya were, culturally, linguistically, and in terms of their relationship to neighboring Andean and Amazonian peoples, also remains less fully resolved than for some other major pre-Columbian Andean cultures. Unlike the Inca, who left behind an extensive, if largely oral and quipu recorded, administrative tradition, documented extensively by Spanish chroniclers, or even cultures like the Moche or Nazca, known for highly distinctive and extensively studied art and iconography, the Chachapoya left a comparatively sparser textual and artistic record for researchers to draw on, with much of what's known reconstructed primarily through architectural and burial archaeology, spread across dozens of sites throughout the Cloud Forest region, of which Kuelap is simply the largest and most thoroughly studied. Linguistic evidence regarding the original Chachapoya language, largely lost following Quechua's spread under Inca and later Spanish colonial influence, remains fragmentary, complicating efforts to fully situate Chachapoya culture within the broader linguistic and migratory history of pre-Columbian South America. What stands today on its cloud-wrapped ridge is a fortress whose sheer defensive ambition speaks clearly enough for itself. Walls built to repel, entrances built to funnel and contain, a settlement clearly organized by a people determined to protect what they had built for as long as the historical record can trace their resistance to outside control. But the finer details of daily life within those walls, the precise function of structures like El Tintero, the full nature of Chachapoya identity and belief before so much of it was filtered through the perspectives of Inca, informants and Spanish chroniclers who knew this culture only briefly and often adversarially, remain only partially recovered. The mist that so often settles over Kuelap's ridge seems, in its own quiet way, an apt metaphor for how much of this site still resists full visibility. What did it mean to be Chachapoya in the final generations before conquest reshaped everything? The circular stone walls, patterned with patient geometric friezes, continue standing in the cloud forest, holding an answer that has so far chosen to stay, like the mist itself, only partially revealed. From the mist-wrapped walls of Kuelap, built by a people determined to resist conquest for as long as stone could hold against it, we cross the Atlantic once more, back to the dry, sun-bleached hills of southeastern Spain, near the city of Almeria, where another fortified settlement, far older, far less defensively successful in the long run, but no less significant to the people who study it, has spent more than a century reshaping our understanding of Europe's earliest complex societies. This is Los Millares, and its layered system of walls, towers, and an extensive surrounding necropolis represents one of the most important and still genuinely puzzling sites of the European Chalcolithic, the so-called Copper Age, that bridged the long Neolithic farming tradition and the metalworking societies that would eventually follow. The settlement sits on a low plateau overlooking the confluence of the Andarax and Huishar rivers, in a landscape that, while arid today, would have offered considerably more favorable agricultural and water resources during the period of the site's primary occupation, generally dated from around 3200 to 2200 BC. What makes Los Millares immediately striking, even to visitors without specialized archaeological training, is the sheer scale and apparent sophistication of its defensive architecture. The settlement was enclosed by not one, but as many as 4 successive concentric walls, built in phases over the course of its long occupation. The outermost and most extensive of these fortifications, stretching for hundreds of meters and incorporating numerous semicircular bastions, projecting towers spaced at regular intervals along the wall's length, designed to allow defenders positioned within them to cover the wall's exterior face with crossfire against any approaching threat. A level of deliberate military engineering that surprised the archaeologists who first excavated the site extensively in the late 19th and 20th centuries, accustomed to viewing Copper Age European communities as considerably less organized in their defensive planning. This fortification effort raises an immediate and still actively debated question. Against whom, precisely, were the people of Los Millares defending themselves so extensively? The Iberian Peninsula during this period was home to numerous scattered farming and early metalworking communities. And while evidence of interpersonal violence does appear in skeletal remains from various Chalcolithic sites across the region, the specific social or political circumstances that would have required fortification on this scale, sustained and expanded across multiple building phases over many centuries, remain only partially reconstructed. Some archaeologists propose that the wealth represented by Los Millares' early and notably skilled copper metallurgy. The site has produced extensive evidence of organized copper smelting and tool production, among the earliest and most developed metalworking traditions documented anywhere on the Iberian Peninsula during this period. May itself have been the primary motivation behind both the settlement's wealth and the need to defend it, with control over copper ore sources and finished metal goods creating exactly the kind of valuable, defensible resource that could provoke sustained conflict with rival communities, competing for access to the same emerging metal-based economy. Other researchers favor a more cautious interpretation, suggesting the elaborate fortifications may reflect social display and prestige as much as genuine, sustained military necessity. A way for the community to project strength and organizational capacity to neighbors and visitors regardless of how frequently that capacity was actually tested in real conflict. Without textual records from the period, and with skeletal evidence of violence present but not overwhelming relative to the scale of the defensive investment, the precise balance between genuine military necessity and symbolic display remains a live, unresolved question among specialists. Beyond its walls, Los Millares is equally significant, and in some respects even more puzzling, for its extensive necropolis, a burial complex containing somewhere between 70 and 100 individual tombs, predominantly of a distinctive type known as tholoi, circular chambered tombs built with corbelled stone roofs, accessed through narrow entrance passages, broadly similar in general engineering concept, though developed independently within a distinct regional tradition, to other Chalcolithic and Bronze Age chambered tombs found across the wider Mediterranean and Atlantic European world, including echoes of the architectural logic seen in the rock-cut Domus de Janus of Sardinia, explored earlier in this series. Many of the Los Millares tombs were used for collective, multi-generational burial, with disarticulated remains of numerous individuals found mixed together within single chambers, alongside substantial grave goods, including finely worked flint tools, ivory objects whose raw material appears to have been imported from considerable distances, ceramics, and copper implements reflecting the settlement's metalworking expertise. The sheer number and density of tombs surrounding a settlement of Los Millares' size has prompted ongoing debate about exactly how the necropolis functioned in relation to the living community. Some researchers have proposed that variation in tomb size, construction quality, and the richness of accompanying grave goods reflects genuine social stratification within Los Millares society, with certain larger, more elaborately constructed tombs reserved for individuals of higher status, possibly emerging hereditary leadership, or specialized roles connected to the community's metalworking expertise, or its evident capacity for large-scale, coordinated construction projects. This interpretation fits within a broader pattern researchers have identified across Chalcolithic Iberia, in which increasing wealth from copper metallurgy and other emerging technologies appears, at numerous sites beyond Los Millares alone, to correlate with growing evidence of social differentiation, a gradual but significant shift away from the more uniformly communal burial practices characteristic of earlier Neolithic societies across the region. Other researchers caution against reading the variation in tomb construction too directly as evidence of rigid social hierarchy, suggesting that differences in tomb size and grave goods could equally reflect differences tied to lineage, family wealth accumulated and expressed only at the point of burial, or ritual factors specific to particular kin groups, rather than necessarily indicating a broader, settlement-wide political hierarchy with consistent ranks of authority. Adding further texture to the puzzle, excavations at Los Millares have recovered a number of carved stone artifacts, including small idols and engraved slate plaques bearing abstract geometric and possibly anthropomorphic designs. Eyes, in particular, appear as a recurring motif across numerous engraved objects found at the site and at related Chalcolithic sites across southern Iberia, sometimes interpreted by researchers as representing a stylized eye goddess or protective symbolic figure, a motif that echoes, in broad concept if not necessarily direct cultural connection, similar eye-emphasizing imagery found at various other Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age sites across the wider Mediterranean world. As with the female figurines discussed at Sesklo earlier in this series, modern archaeology has grown considerably more cautious about confidently assigning a single, unified religious meaning to these recurring symbols across such a wide geographic and chronological range, recognizing that visually similar motifs can emerge independently in different cultural contexts, carrying potentially quite different specific meanings, even when the surface imagery looks remarkably consistent from a distance. Los Millares' eventual decline adds one final layer of unresolved questions to the site. Archaeological evidence suggests the settlement experienced a notable contraction and eventual abandonment sometime around 2200 BC, occurring within a broader regional pattern across southeastern Iberia, in which numerous Chalcolithic fortified settlements appear to have declined or transformed significantly around a similar period, coinciding roughly with the broader transition toward Bronze Age cultural patterns across the wider Iberian Peninsula and Mediterranean world. Whether this decline reflects climatic pressures affecting agricultural productivity in an already marginal, increasingly arid environment, disruption to the copper trade networks that appear to have underpinned much of the settlement's wealth and organizational capacity, internal social transformation, or some combination of these factors interacting with each other across a relatively gradual transition rather than a single dramatic collapse, remains an area of active research rather than settled consensus. What survives today, on the dry plateau above the Andarix Valley, is a landscape of concentric stone walls and dozens of corbelled tombs, evidence of a community that organized itself over many centuries around both genuine technological innovation in early metalworking and a level of defensive and funerary architectural investment that still surprises researchers studying the broader European Chalcolithic. Was Los Millares built primarily to protect hard-won metallurgical wealth from genuine external threat, or to project an image of strength and organization to a wider regional audience? Did its tombs reflect a society already moving decisively toward inherited rank and hierarchy, or one whose differences in burial practice reflected something closer to lineage and circumstance than fixed social class? The walls still trace their concentric rings across the hillside, and the tholoi still hold the mixed, disarticulated bones of a community whose full social structure, religious belief, and ultimate reasons for decline remain only partially recovered from the dry Almerian earth that has kept them, with considerable patience, for well over 4,000 years. From the dry walled plateau of Los Millares, where copper wealth and fortification grew together across centuries of Iberian Chalcolithic life, we return one final time to Sardinia, the island that has given this exploration its rock-cut necropolises and its windswept giants' tombs, to encounter perhaps its strangest monument of all, a structure so unlike anything else built in prehistoric Europe that early archaeologists initially struggled to categorize it at all. This is Monte da Codi, and rising from the flat agricultural plain near Sassari in the island's northwest, it presents something genuinely rare among the sites explored throughout this series. A true stepped, truncated pyramid built in Neolithic Europe, at a time when nothing else quite like it existed anywhere else on the continent. The structure itself sits in open countryside, a massive trapezoidal platform built up from layered earth, stone, and rubble, faced originally with cut limestone blocks, rising to a flat summit accessed by a long, straight stone ramp extending outward from one side, ascending gently across roughly 41 meters before reaching the platform's top. In its current excavated and partially reconstructed state, the monument measures approximately 27 by 27 meters at its base, standing some 5.5 meters in height. Modest compared to the scale of pyramidal structures explored elsewhere in this series, from Tiahuanaco's Akapana to the Mesopotamian ziggurats, but startling nonetheless given its remarkably early date and its near-total isolation as an architectural form within prehistoric Europe. Construction of Monte is generally divided by archaeologists into two principal phases. The earlier structure, known as the Red Temple for the ochre pigment found coating portions of its surface, was built by people belonging to the Ozeri culture, the same broader Neolithic Sardinian tradition associated with the fine, painted pottery found within the rock-cut tombs of Anghelu Ruju, explored earlier in this series, with construction generally dated to sometime around 4000 to 3650 BC. This earlier phase appears to have consisted of a smaller stepped platform, accessed by its own ramp, with evidence suggesting the summit once held some form of structure, possibly a shrine or sanctuary, indicated by post holes and other architectural traces recovered during excavation, though the precise form of whatever once stood atop the original platform has not survived in any detail recoverable through archaeology alone. At some point, generally placed by researchers within the following Copper Age, associated with the later Ebelzu Filigosa culture, the original platform was substantially enlarged, essentially encased within a much larger second structure, raising the monument to roughly its current dimensions and giving Monte the layered, two-phase construction history it shares conceptually, if not in form, with the similarly expanded Cairn of Barnenez explored earlier in this series. The site's discovery and excavation history adds its own layer of complication to interpreting what survives. Monte was first recognized as an archaeological site in the 1950s, but the structure had already suffered significant damage well before professional excavation began, having been used for centuries by local farmers as a convenient source of cut stone, with substantial portions of the original facing and upper structure removed and repurposed long before archaeologists arrived to document what remained. This means that, much like the eroded form of Tiahuanaco's Akapana explored earlier in this series, what visitors see today represents a careful reconstruction informed by excavated evidence, foundation traces, and comparative reasoning about similar structures, rather than a perfectly preserved original form, leaving certain specific architectural details, particularly regarding whatever structure once occupied the summit, in a state of informed but ultimately incomplete reconstruction. What makes Monte a genuinely significant puzzle within European prehistory isn't simply its age or its damaged condition, but its profound architectural isolation. Stepped, truncated pyramidal platforms of this general type are well documented in Mesopotamia, as explored earlier at the Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu, and similar architectural logic appears independently across the ancient Americas and parts of Southeast Asia, as seen at Candi Sukuh. But nothing closely comparable to Monte has been identified anywhere else in Neolithic or Copper Age Europe, making it, by current archaeological understanding, an essentially unique architectural experiment on the continent during this period, with no clearly identified predecessor structures on Sardinia itself, and no clearly identified successors either, once the broader Sardinian cultural sequence eventually gave way, many centuries later, to the very different architectural traditions of the Nuragic civilization explored earlier in this series. This isolation has prompted genuine, ongoing scholarly debate about how Monte Dacoti's builders arrived at this particular architectural form. Some researchers have proposed that the structure represents an independent, locally developed solution to a broadly shared human impulse toward elevated monumental ritual platforms, an architectural concept arrived at separately by Sardinian Neolithic communities through their own internal cultural and religious development, without any need to invoke external contact or influence to explain its existence, a position consistent with the broader pattern, observed repeatedly throughout sites explored in this series, of similar architectural solutions emerging independently among unrelated cultures responding to comparable symbolic or practical needs. Other researchers have noted Sardinia's documented position within wider Mediterranean exchange networks during this period, evidenced by obsidian trade connections extending across the western Mediterranean, and have raised the more speculative possibility that some conceptual influence, even if indirect and mediated through several intermediary cultures over an extended period, might have contributed to Monte Dacoti's unusual form. This remains a minority position without strong direct supporting evidence, and most archaeologists currently favor the independent development explanation, while acknowledging that the question of why this particular community, in this particular location, arrived at such an architecturally unusual solution when neighboring Sardinian communities did not, remains genuinely unresolved. The function of the monument adds further layers to the mystery. Excavations around the site's base recovered evidence interpreted as consistent with ritual activity, including animal bone deposits suggesting sacrifice, alongside fragments of ceramics and other material culture broadly consistent with ceremonial rather than primarily residential or defensive use. A large, roughly carved stone sphere, along with several smaller carved stone balls found at the site, have prompted particular curiosity and a range of interpretations, from proposed use as ceremonial objects or markers to more functional suggestions involving their possible role in the construction process itself, perhaps as aids in moving the substantial quantities of stone required to build and later expand the platform, though no interpretation of these carved spheres has achieved firm consensus. Nearby, a large flat stone slab, sometimes interpreted as a sacrificial or ceremonial altar, sits in proximity to the main structure, reinforcing the general scholarly position that Monte Dacoti functioned primarily as a ritual or religious center for the surrounding Neolithic and Copper Age community, though the specific deities, beliefs, or ceremonial practices once associated with the site have left no textual trace and must be inferred, as with so many sites throughout this series, entirely from the physical evidence left behind in stone, bone, and ash. The long, straight ascending ramp leading to the platform's summit raises its own quiet question, echoed at several other monumental sites explored throughout this series. Why construct such a deliberate, extended approach, rather than simpler stairs or a more direct ascent? Some researchers suggest the ramp's gradual, processional quality may have been intentional, designed to create a deliberate, controlled approach to whatever ceremonies took place at the summit, allowing participants or observers a slow, visible transition from the surrounding agricultural plain into a more elevated, sacred space, an architectural choice for managing the physical and psychological experience of approaching a monument, not unlike the deliberately restrictive entrances found at the giants' tombs explored earlier in this series, where the physical act of approach itself appears to have carried ritual significance distinct from simple practical access. What remains today at Monte Dacoti, on its quiet agricultural plain outside Sassari, is a reconstructed but still genuinely puzzling monument. A pyramid built by Neolithic farmers who, as far as current archaeological evidence indicates, developed this particular architectural solution largely on their own, without clear precedent on their own island or close parallel anywhere else in prehistoric Europe, only to see the form essentially vanish from the Sardinian landscape in the centuries that followed, replaced eventually by the very different stone towers and tombs of the Nuragic Age. Why did this particular architectural impulse appear here, take root for centuries across two distinct phases of expansion, and then disappear so completely, leaving no clear successor structure anywhere on the island? The ramp still rises gently across the plain, leading toward a summit whose original sanctuary has long since vanished, asking visitors who climb it today to imagine what kind of ceremony, what kind of belief, could justify building something this architecturally singular, this far ahead of anything comparable built anywhere nearby, and then allowing the tradition itself to quietly fade from memory. From the solitary, unrepeated pyramid of Monte da Codi, standing as Sardinia's lone architectural experiment in stone, we travel east across the Mediterranean and into the southern Caucasus, to a windswept plateau near the town of Sisian in Armenia, where hundreds of standing stones rise from the high grassland in a pattern that has, for several decades now, fueled one of the more contentious astronomical debates in prehistoric archaeology. This is Karahunge, also known by its Armenian name Zorat's Kerer, and depending on which researcher you ask, it is either a culturally significant but relatively conventional Bronze Age burial and ritual site, or one of the oldest astronomical observatories ever constructed by human hands. The site sits at an elevation of roughly 170 meters, spread across a rocky plateau that offers commanding, largely unobstructed views of the surrounding mountain landscape. More than 200 standing stones, most carved from local basalt, rise across the site, ranging in height from under half a meter to over 2 meters, many arranged in rough, elongated configurations that early researchers initially compared, somewhat loosely, to the famous stone circle at Stonehenge in England, a comparison that has stuck firmly in popular usage, with Karahunge frequently described in tourism and popular media as the Armenian Stonehenge, despite the site's actual layout being considerably less circular and considerably more elongated and irregular than its English namesake. What immediately distinguishes many of the stones at Karahunge from typical standing stone monuments elsewhere in the world is a distinctive physical feature. A number of the stones, by most counts somewhere around 80 of the roughly 200 surviving uprights, contain a single circular hole bored cleanly through the upper portion of the stone, ranging from a few centimeters to perhaps 10 centimeters in diameter. Passages clearly intentional rather than the product of natural weathering, given their consistent placement and clean, rounded edges. It's these holes, more than any other single feature, that have driven the site's most prominent and most disputed interpretation. Archaeological investigation of the broader site has confirmed that Karahunge functioned, at least in part, as a burial ground, with associated tombs and grave goods recovered from excavations conducted across various periods of the site's use, generally indicating activity spanning a considerable range of time, from as early as the Bronze Age, with some researchers proposing origins reaching back toward the 3rd millennium BC, through continued use and likely modification into more recent historical periods, including evidence of activity associated with later cultures in the region up through the medieval period. This funerary association represents the more cautious, broadly accepted mainstream archaeological position. Karahunge has a long-used ritual and burial complex, its standing stones serving primarily commemorative, territorial, or ceremonial functions broadly comparable to standing stone traditions documented at numerous other sites across Europe and the Caucasus, with the hold stones representing a distinctive, but not necessarily astronomically purposeful, regional architectural tradition, their specific function within ritual or commemorative practice not fully reconstructed from the surviving physical evidence alone. The more ambitious and considerably more contested interpretation emerged most prominently through the research of Armenian radiophysicist Paris Harouni, who conducted detailed surveys of the site beginning in the 1990s. Harouni proposed that Karahangi functioned as a deliberately engineered astronomical observatory, arguing that a significant number of the hold stones were precisely oriented to track the rising and setting positions of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, as well as positions associated with specific bright stars, and that the holes themselves were specifically sized and positioned to function as sighting devices, allowing observers to track these celestial events with a level of precision Harouni argued was comparable to, or in some specific respects exceeded, the astronomical alignments documented at far more extensively studied sites like Stonehenge. Harouni further proposed an early date for the site's primary construction, suggesting an age extending back to around 5500 BC, a date considerably earlier than the Bronze Age dating more commonly accepted within mainstream Armenian and broader archaeological scholarship, and one that, if accepted, would place Karahangi among the very oldest deliberately constructed astronomical monuments anywhere in the world, predating even the earliest phases of Stonehenge by several thousand years. This proposal generated significant public attention, both within Armenia, where the site has become a source of considerable national cultural interest, and internationally among researchers interested in archaeoastronomy. It has also generated significant scholarly pushback. Critics of Harouni's astronomical interpretation, including several archaeologists and archaeoastronomers who have conducted independent analysis of the site's stone alignments, have raised a range of methodological concerns, broadly similar to those raised about ambitious astronomical claims at other megalithic sites worldwide, a pattern this series has touched on before. With more than 200 stones scattered across an irregular plateau, critics argue the sheer number of potential alignments between any given pair or cluster of stones, combined with numerous celestial bodies and positions one might choose to test those alignments against, creates a statistical environment in which finding some plausible-looking astronomical correlations becomes almost unavoidable, regardless of whether the original builders intended any specific astronomical function at all. A methodological challenge often referred to within archaeoastronomy as the problem of multiple comparisons, where searching hard enough across enough possible alignments will eventually produce apparent matches purely by chance. Critics have also pointed out that many of the holes bored through the stones appear, on closer inspection, less precisely or consistently oriented than would be expected of a deliberately engineered observational instrument, with considerable variation in angle and positioning that sits somewhat uneasily with the high degree of measured astronomical precision Harouni's analysis proposed. Additionally, the considerably earlier date Harouni proposed for the site's primary construction has not been independently corroborated through more conventional archaeological dating methods applied to the broader site, which, as noted, generally support a Bronze Age and later chronology, rather than the late Neolithic date Harouni's astronomical interpretation would seem to require for full coherence. The honest, scholarly position, then as now, sits somewhere between full endorsement and complete dismissal. Most archaeologists working on Caucasian prehistory accept that Karahangi held genuine ritual and funerary significance across an extended period of use, and many are open to the possibility that certain alignments at the site, whether deliberately engineered or arrived at through repeated practical observation, embedded gradually into an existing ritual landscape, may carry some genuine astronomical significance, consistent with the broader, well-documented pattern of solar and celestial alignment found at numerous Bronze Age and Neolithic sites across Europe and the Caucasus, several of which have appeared throughout this very exploration, from Maeshowe's solstice alignment to the orientation of Stony Littleton's entrance passage. What remains considerably more contested is the specific, more elaborate claim that Karahunga functioned as a precisely engineered, purpose-built astronomical instrument on the scale and sophistication Harouni proposed, constructed at a date several thousand years earlier than the broader archaeological evidence from the site currently supports. What makes Karahunga a genuinely worthwhile inclusion in this exploration isn't a confirmed answer to which interpretation is correct, but rather the broader pattern it illustrates, one that has surfaced repeatedly throughout this series, at sites from Gunung Padang to the Plain of Jars. The persistent tension between a site's documented, evidence-supported archaeological history and the more ambitious, sometimes nationally or culturally significant narratives that grow up around genuinely impressive ancient monuments, particularly when those monuments contain features like Karahunga's mysteriously bored stone holes that lend themselves naturally to dramatic interpretation. The holes are real. Their precise original purpose, whether primarily astronomical, primarily symbolic or ritual, structurally practical in some way, not yet fully understood, or some combination of functions that shifted across the many centuries the site appears to have remained in active use, has not been definitively settled by the evidence currently available. Today, the standing stones of Karahunga still rise from the high Armenian plateau, their bored holes catching wind and occasional shafts of mountain light, surrounded by the graves of people whose beliefs about the sky above them, whatever those beliefs precisely entailed, remain only partially recoverable through the stone they left behind. Were these holes deliberately bored sighting tubes, engineered with genuine astronomical intent by a Bronze Age or earlier community tracking the movements of sun and stars across this elevated landscape? Or were they crafted for reasons more closely tied to ritual, burial practice, or symbolic meaning now lost to us? Their resemblance to deliberate astronomical alignment more a product of pattern-seeking minds many centuries removed from the stone's original purpose than of the builder's actual intent. The wind continues to move through more than 200 carved openings on that high plateau, and whatever message it once carried, whether measured in starlight or simply in memory, has not yet been fully translated by anyone studying it since. From the wind-carved stones of the Armenian highlands, where holes bored through basalt continue to pose more questions than they answer, we descend to sea level once more, to the Pacific coast of Peru, just north of the modern city of Huacho, where a settlement far older than nearly anything else explored in this series sits quietly between desert and ocean, old enough, in fact, to challenge long-held assumptions about where and when complex civilization first took root in the Americas. This is Banduria, and though it lacks the soaring monuments or carved mysteries of some sites we've visited, its true significance lies in something almost more unsettling than any individual artifact: its sheer, startling age. Banduria forms part of the broader Norte Chico, or Caral Soup, civilization, a cluster of monumental sites concentrated along Peru's arid central coast and the river valleys feeding into it, now recognized by most archaeologists as representing the oldest known complex society in the Americas, and one of only a handful of locations worldwide where monumental architecture and organized urban life appear to have developed entirely independently, without influence or contact from other early civilizational centers in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or elsewhere. While the nearby site of Caral has become the most famous representative of this culture, drawing the bulk of international attention and research funding since its major excavation began in the 1990s, Banduria offers its own distinct and, in certain respects, more puzzling window into this remarkably early chapter of American civilization, with archaeological evidence indicating occupation beginning as early as 3000 BC and continuing for well over a millennium afterward. What makes this dating so significant is its position relative to the broader global timeline this series has traced. At roughly 3000 BC, the Great Pyramids of Egypt remained centuries in the future. Mesopotamian city-states were only beginning to coalesce into the complex urban societies that would eventually produce structures like the Ziggurat of Dur-Kurigalzu, explored earlier in this series. And on the Pacific coast of South America, the people of Banduria were already constructing substantial platform mounds, organizing themselves into communities large enough to undertake significant collective building projects. And doing so, crucially, without pottery, Banduria and the broader Norte Chico civilization developed monumental architecture before the introduction of ceramic technology to the region, a sequence that inverts the developmental pattern long assumed by archaeologists studying the rise of early civilizations elsewhere in the world, where pottery production has traditionally been treated as an earlier, foundational technological step preceding monumental construction, rather than following or coexisting separately from it. Excavations at Banduria, conducted significantly under the direction of Peruvian archaeologist Alejandro Chu Barrera, beginning in the early 2000s, have revealed a site considerably more architecturally complex than its relatively modest visible remains might initially suggest. The settlement includes several substantial platform mounds, constructed using a building technique common across Norte Chico sites known as shikra, in which large mesh bags woven from plant fiber were filled with stone and rubble, then stacked and layered to form the structural core of the mounds before being faced with finished stone or plaster. An engineering solution that proved remarkably effective at providing both structural stability and a degree of flexibility helpful in a seismically active region. A practical innovation whose effectiveness modern engineers studying the site have noted with genuine appreciation. Around and within these mounds, excavators have uncovered residential structures, evidence of organized communal space, and a substantial necropolis containing numerous burials, several of which have provided some of the most striking and still debated evidence recovered from the site. Among Banduria's most significant funerary discoveries are burials containing substantial quantities of cotton textiles, some employing sophisticated weaving and dyeing techniques, alongside necklaces and ornaments crafted from shell, stone beads, and other materials reflecting both local craftsmanship and evidence of exchange networks extending beyond the immediate Huacho region. Particularly notable among the recovered textiles are examples incorporating complex geometric patterns and, in some interpretations, possible representational imagery, predating by a considerable margin the more famous and extensively studied textile traditions of later Peruvian coastal cultures like the Paracas, whose elaborate woven and embroidered textiles are widely celebrated within Andean archaeology. This raises a genuinely open question that current evidence hasn't fully resolved. How much of the sophisticated textile artistry, long associated with later, better documented Peruvian coastal civilizations, actually has its roots in this much earlier Norte Chico period, quietly developing across Banduria and related sites for centuries, before later cultures inherited, refined, and ultimately received far greater recognition for techniques whose deepest origins may lie considerably further back than commonly assumed. The economic foundation supporting Banduria's monumental construction adds another layer to the site's significance and its remaining uncertainties. Unlike many early civilizations that developed around intensive grain agriculture, the Norte Chico communities, including Banduria, appear to have built their complex society around a somewhat different economic combination. Cultivation of cotton, used primarily for textiles, and, crucially, for manufacturing fishing nets, alongside various food crops, including squash, beans, and acacia, combined with what appears to have been intensive exploitation of the exceptionally rich marine resources available along this stretch of Peru's Pacific coastline, one of the most productive fishing zones in the world due to the cold, nutrient-rich Humboldt Current running offshore. This has led to what's sometimes called the Maritime Foundation's hypothesis for the rise of Norte Chico civilization, proposing that abundant marine protein, rather than grain surplus in the more traditionally assumed pattern of early civilizational development, provided the economic foundation that allowed Banduria and related communities to support large, settled populations capable of undertaking monumental construction projects without the same degree of dependence on intensive cereal agriculture that characterized early civilizations elsewhere. This hypothesis remains an area of active research and some genuine scholarly debate, with subsequent research suggesting the relationship between marine resources and inland agricultural production across Norte Chico sites was likely more interconnected and complex than a simple either-or framework allows, with cotton cultivation specifically serving as a crucial link between the two economic spheres, since cotton itself required irrigated inland agriculture. Yet its primary economic value lay in supporting the fishing economy through net production, weaving the coastal and inland aspects of Norte Chico subsistence together in ways researchers are still working to fully map across the dozens of related sites scattered throughout the region. What remains less certain, and considerably more difficult to reconstruct, is the precise nature of social and political organization that allowed Banduria's community to undertake the kind of sustained, coordinated labor required for its monumental architecture across so many generations, in the complete absence of any writing system, in a period predating not just Andean civilizations like the Inca by thousands of years, but predating by a significant margin the development of any of the more familiar hallmarks, writing, large-scale metallurgy, wheeled transport, that archaeologists have traditionally associated with the emergence of complex, hierarchically organized societies elsewhere in the world. Was Banduria governed by an emerging hereditary elite, capable of directing significant communal labor toward monumental construction? Or did its building projects emerge through some less hierarchical, more genuinely communal form of organization, coordinated through religious or kinship structures rather than concentrated political authority in the way later Andean civilizations would more clearly demonstrate? The burial evidence recovered so far doesn't show the kind of dramatic, unmistakable wealth disparity found at some other early civilizational sites worldwide, leaving open the genuine possibility that Banduria's society organized its considerable collective achievements through social mechanisms that don't map cleanly onto more familiar models of early state formation developed primarily from studying Old World civilizations. Banduria's relationship to neighboring Norte Chico sites, including the more extensively excavated and far more famous Corral, also remains a subject of ongoing archaeological interest. Were these dozens of contemporary settlements scattered across the Norte Chico region, functioning as genuinely independent communities, loosely connected through trade and shared cultural practice? Or did some looser regional political or religious network bind them together in ways the current, still developing archaeological record hasn't yet fully clarified? With Banduria itself only systematically excavated beginning in the early 2000s, and large portions of the broader Norte Chico region still comparatively understudied relative to better-known later Andean civilizations, researchers working on this period regularly emphasize that significant gaps in understanding remain, not from any inherent unsolvable mystery embedded in the evidence itself, but simply from the scale of careful, patient excavation still required to fully map a civilization this old, this geographically extensive, and this comparatively recently recognized within the broader scope of archaeological attention. What stands today at Banduria, between the Pacific surf and the dry coastal desert, is a settlement whose true significance lies less in any single dramatic, unanswered riddle, and more in the sheer, quiet weight of its age. A community that organized itself into something recognizably complex and monumental nearly 5,000 years ago, independently of every other early civilizational cradle this series has explored, using cotton, fish, and shikra-filled platform mounds rather than grain, bronze, or writing, to build something that has outlasted nearly everyone and everything that came after it locally for thousands of years. How much more of this story still lies buried beneath the dunes and irrigated fields of Peru's central coast, waiting for the kind of patient, sustained excavation that has only just begun to properly uncover it. Banduria offers no dramatic final answer, only the steady, accumulating evidence of a civilization that built first and explained itself, if it ever did at all, in a language none of us have yet learned to read.